Take a slow breath in and out. Welcome, friend, to a gentle passage through history, told as if the night itself were turning pages for you. In this video, you'll be carried across quiet waters and soft fields to 20 moments when Denmark's story tightened into a single heartbeat. A mill watching over Dybbøl at dawn, lanterns hooded for the crossing to oars, a narrow gate at Masunda, where water and will stood together, the copper roofs of Copenhagen listening to distant guns, the green-grey grammar of Koldberger Heide and Fehmarn Belt, winter iron at Lund, the hinge at Nyborg, ladders whispering against Copenhagen's walls, oars slipping into Heligoland, clay ramparts at Fredericia, the long reign of Isted, the thoughtful step back at Kolding, Luther's hard humility, Kalmar's patient stones, and the modern thunder near the red cliff of Heligoland before we end in summer light over the hedgerows of Køge, where citizen hands steadied muskets for a single measured day. You won't be rushed, you won't be shouted at. This is a slow, steady telling, made for late hours and calm rooms, descriptions that move like moonlight across water, a voice that favours images over noise, ropes creaking softly, dew on hedges, the careful weight of a plank set where a boot will land in 4 seconds' time. We'll keep the scale human, farmers and carpenters, pilots and powder boys, chaplains with short blessings, sergeants who speak in shoulders and breath, so every larger event feels as close as a warm cup in your hands. And as we travel, we'll notice the quieter kinds of courage, keeping a doorway through winter, keeping a law on water where wind forgets, keeping a lane in the rain until a larger field opens in sun. If you're settling down for sleep, let this be your lantern. If you're tidying a room, making tea, or travelling by night, let the cadence carry you. Between scenes, I'll leave small open images for your mind to rest on. A white mill in morning haze, a ribbon of fjord holding its breath, church bells counting an ordinary hour after an extraordinary day. The goal isn't to dazzle, it's to soothe, to help your thoughts fold neatly like maps after a journey well made. Before we drift onward, I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it where you are? Share it in the comments so this quiet circle can feel a little closer. Copenhagen at midnight, Hanoi at dawn, New York in the blue hour, a small village somewhere between fields and sea. There's a special comfort in knowing these stories travel across time zones, meeting you exactly where you are. If this kind of storytelling feels right, if the soft pace, the historical care, and the sleep-friendly tone bring you a bit of peace, please tap the like button so the algorithm knows to light the path for others who need a gentle companion. And if you'd like more nights like this, subscribe to the entire history. It helps us return episode after episode with new journeys told in the same calm, steadfast voice. Ancient roads walked slowly, rivers crossed at dawn, cities introduced by their bells. You can even ring the notification bell softly, as one might close a door without waking the house. All set? Let your shoulders drop. Let the room settle. Imagine the first page turning, quiet as a tide, and the map of Denmark appearing in lantern glow, belts and islands, shoals that taught captains to listen, fields that remember footsteps longer than ink. We'll begin at a ridge where a mill watches. We'll end where parish bells ring for presence more than triumph. Between those two notes stretches a country's patience and a listener's peace. Take another slow breath. When you're ready, follow the voice into the night and let history do what it does best when told gently. Keep you company until sleep arrives. Part 1, Dybbøl, 1864. In In this first quiet chapter, listeners arrive at Dybbøl as if stepping on to damp grass before dawn, the mist lifting in pale veils. He stands, or perhaps a whole people stands, behind earthworks that look like low, sleeping hills. Schleswig's spring is slow and grey. The wind carries brackish scents from the fjord and a thrum like distant hooves, though it is not cavalry, but batteries being readied in the half-light. This part tells of Dybbøl, a ridge, a line of forts, scooped from sand and clay, and the wish that they might hold when everything else has slipped away. Before this moment there had been Danvik, that old wall sown into the soil of memory, abandoned under winter skies. And now the soldiers of a modest kingdom, coats buttoned against a sour breeze, returned to the basic truth of defence: spade, plank, and courage, measured quietly in the throat. They wanted, very simply, to keep a corner of the world called home. That desire, so unadorned it hardly needs a flag, moved along the parapets like a whispered prayer. Boys from islands whose names float like birdsong, men from Copenhagen streets that smell of tar and rye bread, officers who have studied maps until the rivers look like blue scars, each carried a version of the same wish. Let this line be enough. Let the guns behind them speak loudly enough that their mothers will not hear the other guns, the ones across the field. He, the archetypal defender, not one man but many, imagined afterwards, stepping through a doorway, unbuckling mud-stiff leather, setting the musket aside. He imagined the mill still turning on the hill, and the cattle led to water as if April had never learned the language of shells. Yet inside the line, in the quiet between blasts, doubts pressed like cold fingers. The redoubts were not finished. Not really. The angles of fire were narrower than the textbooks, the traverses too low. Ammunition had to be counted like coins. Some remembered the retreat from Danvik, the stinging sense of leaving something ancient and trusted, and wondered if that shadow would return, lengthened by the morning sun. Others carried smaller, more private burdens, a letter not yet answered, a friend shifted to another company and not seen again. Even the bravest had that flicker of hesitation when the wind changed and brought the enemy's language across the fields, this murmuring of commands, this metallic clearing of 1,000 throats. Outside, beyond the scrub and the furrows, stood the shape of opposition in iron and discipline. The Prussian and Austrian guns had settled in like a second mechanical landscape, siege lines, parallels, careful surveying rods stabbing the air. Carriages creaked, fuses whispered, and a flock of black-coated staff officers moved from hillock to hillock, cool as crows counting the furrows. Weather, too, stood against the ridge, the kind of damp that slugs powder, the kind of haze that hides a limber until the first shot is already on its way. Railways and telegraphs stitched the enemy to their magazines, to Berlin, to Vienna. The Danes had courage and coastline, but the calculus of the century had new numbers in it, and they were difficult to recite while shivering behind a parapet. Still, there were small graces, sources of steadiness that cup a flame against the gust, engineers who knew the grain of timber and the patience of clay, non-commissioned officers whose voices could smooth panic into breathing, chaplains who walked the line not to speak of thunder but of bread. The Dybbøl mill itself, white against the smudged sky, became a kind of companion, turning when it could, standing when it could not, an old wooden spine against which men seemed straighter. Letters came up from the rear with curls of familiar handwriting. Someone mixed coffee as if this were any morning. A fiddler, it was said, tuned 3 strings and could not find the 4th, and laughed, and that shared laugh travelled further than any order of the day. Then the long, low drum of artillery began to climb. In the early weeks it was a pattern, shells probing, sappers inching, but on the 18th of April it gathered itself into a heavy continuous speech. The forts were numbered. Those numbers, meant for clarity, now felt like a cold inventory of places where air turned sharp and soil leapt like startled fish. Earth shook and lifted and settled again. Gabions burst like wicker fruit. The lip of the parapet seemed to melt and re-harden under the hammering. He crouched, stood, fired, swabbed, and the cycle narrowed until it felt like breathing. In with dirt and smoke, out with grit and prayer. Toward midday, the far field began to ripple, grey lines moving at a measured pace, officers' swords not flashing but steady, bayonets smouldering like a low constellation. Assault came as a change in temperature. The air itself felt leaner. Signals rose. The guns shifted to a rolling thunder that walked ahead of the infantry and then stepped aside. Ladders touched the scarred face of the works. Muskets barked in short, shocked barks. The world shrank to hands and boards, and the hot, strange intimacy of a struggle, measured in feet, not miles. A standard went down and down again, and time lost its edges, seconds like long rooms. There were moments of stunning competence, a section pivoting, a gun run out by pure will, and moments where memory would always refuse to settle into an orderly line. Over it all, that mill watched without blinking. What follows, even told softly, cannot be reversed. Positions were overrun. A fort that had been a stubborn tooth became suddenly a gap. Runners carried messages that felt heavier than paper. Orders to fall back had the salt taste of betrayal only until the first corner was turned and the living were counted and counted again. The ridge that had looked so solid from a distance showed its seams, and through those seams history flowed, as it always does, to lower ground. Boats were made ready, guns spiked or hauled. The flag came down in a gesture both careful and aching, and then there was only the measured, practiced work of withdrawal, the professionalism that keeps grief from tripping on its own feet. In the evenings that followed, the survivors remembered unlikely things, the exact heft of a sodden sandbag, the way a skylark rose oblivious during the bombardment, a corporal's hand steadying a ladder and then being not there. They also remembered stubbornly that desire with which this part began, to keep a small place safe, to draw a boundary with one's body and say enough. And losing Dybbøl did not erase the word, it only pressed it deeper into the tongue. The mill, pocked and scarred, would stand again. A nation's symbols are timbered, not only with triumphs. So the first part closes with water. He stands at a shoreline that smells of eelgrass and iron, watching craft slip out toward a darker smudge, the island of owls. Lanterns are hooded against the wind. Orders travel at a whisper. Somewhere behind, the ridges already fading into the night and into memory. Somewhere ahead, there is an island road, a still farm, a low hedge where dawn might catch its sleeve. The oars dip. The hull sighs, and over the quiet surface of the sound, the story glides, patient and unhurried, toward the next page. You're now listening to Part 2, Owls, 1864. Tonight's chapter drifts over dark water, where oars move like careful breaths, and an island holds its last lanterns low. He stands at the gunwale, with the brackish scent of the Alsund rising around him, a thin mist folding and unfolding over the channel like a pale blanket, and in that breath-held hour before dawn, the island of Als feels less like earth than a memory that refuses to loosen its hand. Farms crouch under their thatch, orchards hold their silhouettes, and the wind combs the barley so gently that even the sentries blink as if the field itself might be telling them to rest. Yet no one truly rests. The day after Dybbøl has left its thrum in the bones, and men who have carried sandbags and hope in equal measure now carry a quieter thing, the need to keep this strip of ground until someone merciful says enough. On the shore behind them, lamps are hooded. Signals are spoken more with fingertips than with tongues, and a low murmur passes along the defences near Sønderborg. Check the fuses, count the cartridges, set the pickets where the hedge thins, because if the mainland has slipped away, perhaps the island can still be a small, stubborn sentence at the end of a long paragraph. They want, with a simplicity that does not ask permission from history, to hold an island whose fields smell of apples in September and kelp in March, to see someday soon smoke rise from the farmhouse stoves and not from batteries, to hear the creak of a wagon rather than the careful scrape of a scaling ladder. Officers sketch arcs in the air with gloved fingers, NCOs steady hands and breathing. A chaplain's shadow pauses by a gun and then moves on without a word, as if blessing the timber itself. But inside the chest, where the heart is a quiet drum, doubts tap their small sticks. The guns are fewer, the parapets patched with reeds and wishful boards, and the water that protects also invites, because water carries what it is told to carry, even soldiers. Across that breathing channel, the opposition has turned night into a tool. On the far bank, the Prussian preparations knit themselves with the same cold patience that had crept up to Dybbøl. Pontoons ready to kiss the current, boats with their oars wrapped in cloth, small columns coiled in the dark like grey ropes waiting to be flung. Engineers count the width. Staff officers gauge wind and tide. Watchmen listen not to music, but to rhythm. How many strokes to cross? How many heartbeats between signal and surge? The weather, an old ally of no one, lends a gentle haze that blurs shapes without muffling sound. Even the moon seems undecided, peering and then hiding as if etiquette requires it to look away. A telegraph's thin nerve hums far behind the lines, drawing decisions from rooms where maps are spread and coffee is strong. Here at the edge, the calculus is more primitive. Distance, breath, and the weight of a man's body when he climbs into a boat. The defenders sense it like the pressure before rain, the way a field grows still, the way a dog lifts its head. Nothing moves, and everything is already in motion. There are helps too, small and human, cupped around the candle flame of resolve. An islander who knows the slur of mud in one cove warns a lieutenant where the footing fails. A veteran gunner teaches a boy how to listen for the different vowels of incoming fire, shell, shrapnel, solid shot, and the boy nods gravely as if he is being taught a hymn. A carpenter turns broken planks into revetments, then leans his cheek against the cool wood like a father. A runner returns with a pouch of cartridges and a loaf of coarse bread, both equally welcomed. Even the distant bell from a cowshed, stirred by some mild accident of wind, sounds briefly like a promise that morning is still a thing that happens. Yet the island's very tenderness becomes the hardest part to defend. Gardens cannot be angled for enfilade, and hedges cannot be persuaded to turn grapeshot. The inner struggle, the quiet arithmetic of short rations and long expectations, scuffs at morale until boots feel heavier than they are. A man remembers Danvik and feels in his ribs the hollow made by leaving. He fears that hollowness could widen here, over water. A soul arrives without bravado, like a decision already made elsewhere. First there is only an irregular stitching, the wet hush of many oars, the soft tap of a boat's nose finding another boat's stern. A flare would be too much light. Instead, signals pass as a scythe through the ranks, and the channel fills with purposeful shadows. At an appointed breath, the artillery speaks, not the grand theatre of day bombardment, but a narrowed, intimate thunder that reaches across the water and touches parapets, embrasures and thoughts. The Danish guns answer in brief, well-aimed sentences, and for a moment the opposing languages of iron seem almost conversational. "Here is my range," says one. "Here is my reply," says the other. Then ladders appear like spare ribs against the island's flank. The first boots slap mud, slip, recover. Officers' swords are not for flashing now, but for pointing, a geometry of motion traced in quick, stern arcs. The defenders fire by feel as much as by sight. Muzzle flashes fold and unfold like small bright flowers battling the dew. And between shots men hear the oddest domestic sounds, the cluck of a hen startled in a byre, the clatter of a pail that had been left thoughtlessly by a door, the breath of a cow. Islands keep their habits even under war. Within the works, courage performs its unrecorded labours. A gun crew, short-handed, runs a piece out with a rhythm learned on farms. Heave, set, breathe. A corporal who has never spoken loudly becomes a bell and gathers a wavering file into a straight line. Two friends exchange a glance that says, "We will both be here on the other side of this minute," and believe themselves for just long enough. They countercharge along a ditch that fills as quickly with smoke as with men. There is a lunge, a shout, a sudden nearness of another human face where a face has no right to be, and the ancient puzzle of battle, how close two strangers must come to end each other, solves itself with a dull finality. Somewhere a reserve moves too slowly. Somewhere a path is longer in darkness than on the map. Boats multiply like thoughts, footholds become thresholds. The island begins, in spite of all loving intention, to feel like a house being entered by many doors at once. The crest of it, the part that cannot be retold without the air tightening, comes when positions that were meant to support each other fall silent in a stuttering cadence. One gun seizes, another is masked by smoke. A traverse collapses under the weight of the morning, deciding what to be. Orders to fall back are nothing like surrender in the hearts that hear them. They are the surgeon's low command, when the bleeding will not stop. Men move with that particular clipped grace of trained retreat, hauling what can be hauled, spiking what must be left. A flag dips, hesitates, and is borne away with a care that belongs in a church. The island does not so much yield as exhale, and the channel that offered hope now accepts the heavy shapes of boats going the other way, toward Jutland shores, toward lines that will have to be drawn again with the smaller compass of what remains. When quiet returns, it does so imperfectly, like a door that never quite closes after being forced. The orchard lifts a branch to the ground. A shed leans, surprised. The dew indifferent glitters, as if it has been practicing all night. Survivors remember the feel of eelgrass snagging a bootlace, the ghost warmth of a mug of coffee handed along a line, the sudden music of a skylark that refused to consult the artillery schedule. They remember, more than anything, that the wish which brought them here is not a factory-made wish. It is handmade, stitched by mothers and lovers, and the winter patience of people who think in terms of fields and seasons. Losing else does not burn that wish. It inks it deeper. Somewhere a fisherman will talk about this crossing as if it were weather. Somewhere a child will ask whether the island will float away now, and someone kind will say no. Islands keep their places even when people are asked to leave them for a time. And as this chapter softens toward its last lines, the water widens into thought. He looks back once, and the island is already wearing a veil of daylight, the kind that hides scuffs and shows contours. Ahead, the waterways braid into older paths. The Schlei, the line where fort and river once shook hands, a gate called my Sunder that remembers both bravery and turning away. The oars lift and sink. Gulls wheel without comment. A low mist lifts from the reeds, like a rolled parchment beginning to open. In that pale, patient light, the story inclines toward another bank, another threshold where a narrow passage once decided more than it had any right to decide. You're now listening to Part 3, My Sunde, 1864. In this quiet night's recollection, we return to a narrow gate on the Schlei, to a winter pallor where water and earth hold their breath together. He stands not as one man, but as a memory of a line, a low, stubborn seam at my Sunde, where the land funnels into a passage and the fjord leans close, and though the calendar is earlier than Dybbøl and ours, the heart understands stories not by dates, but by the feel of resolve under cold fingers. Here the origin is simple, a gate to be kept. The Danavik hangs behind like a faded tapestry, stitched by ancestors. In front, the Prussian columns gather in the chalk grey of a February morning, their drums careful, their geometry exact. The Danish wish is spare as winter branches, to hold a place so small it can be sketched with a thumb, to let the water on either side become a patient ally, to make the word enough audible across a narrow field. Yet within the breast, doubts knock. What if the old wall behind is only a story now? What if numbers and new guns make a language the defenders cannot speak? What if retreat is already coiled in the day, like a snake asleep under straw? Boots slip on frost, breath plumes. A letter in a pocket becomes the heaviest thing a man carries. Beyond the hedges, the enemy arranges itself like lines on graph paper, batteries sighted with neat malice, skirmishers tasting the edges, staff officers tapping at reality with the tips of their canes as if the world were obedient chalk. But the water is near, and from that water come small helps, practical and human, gunboats nosing along the Schlei like blunt, watchful animals, their crews speaking in low, competent tones, while on shore an old ferryman shows a lieutenant where the mud deceives, where a cart once sank to its axle, where even a careful man will hurry and be lost. In the works, carpenters know the grain of pine, sappers trust the stubbornness of sandbags, and NCOs carry steadiness like a lantern held to the wind's lee. The opening drum of iron is not a cascade, but a cold tapping, feelers of shrapnel searching the parapets. The defenders answer in measured pulses, no bravado, only the discipline of breath, in, aim, out, the geometry of survival. Soon the field smokes as if a low fog has decided to speak. The Prussian lines step forward and blur, reform and step again, and the fjord repeats each sound twice, once in air, once in water, so that the mind must choose which echo to obey. A boy learns quickly the syllables of incoming fire. An officer's hand, gloved and calm, adjusts a barrel as if straightening a picture on a wall. The assault tightens, ladders bump, squads unfold, like grey handkerchiefs shaken open, and the ditch fills with a struggle intimate enough to hear another man's heart counting. Within the redoubts, fear does not shout. It uses small tools, dry mouth, tight fingers, and is answered by smaller, stronger tools, habit, tone of voice, the memory of a drill done in better weather. A gunboat out on the Schlei finds its range. Its shells stitch the near bank with stern, protective patience. Men on the works feel that sound not as thunder, but as a steadying palm between the shoulder blades. For a long minute, that seems to be an hour. My Sonde becomes a hinge on which a whole campaign swings, and the hinge does not snap. It bends and groans and holds. Then the attack loses heat, the way coals do when spread too thin. Flags that had leaned forward lean back. Lines that had become a fist become fingers again. Orders ride away, with a chill in their voice. On the works, no one cheers loudly. Winter does not like to be startled. But a warmth rises that is not from any brazier, the hush of having asked for so little and been granted that little by the stubborn arithmetic of courage and place. The result is not triumph, but breathing space, not victory's brass, but the soft clink of tools as positions are tidied, the quiet blessing of hot coffee decanted into tin, the strange intimacy of a lark lifting as if the sky must keep its appointments. And yet even in relief, the men know how fragile such holding is. A gate can be kept today and opened tomorrow by hands that look very similar. The century is already teaching new sums in steel and wire. They clean the guns, mend a splintered traverse, and tuck away the lesson my sunder offers without speaking. That water and will, aligned, can make a narrow place wide enough for a nation to pass through the day. Evening leans in, soft as wool. The schlei darkens until it is a ribbon of ink drawn across the land, and far away, beyond fields that will be green in another season, a city of spires and shipmasts waits in the mind. The copper roofs of a capital, the forest of spars and rigging, the hush before a fleet's slow heartbeat. As lamps are shaded and the frost returns, he lifts his gaze from the parapet and sees, through smoke that has thinned into memory, the faint outline of a harbour where stone and sea will soon learn a harsher dialect of fire. The night seems to tilt toward that horizon where Copenhagen's rooftops gather like sleeping gulls, and the next page rustles with the wings of bomb catchers sliding toward a silent, unsuspecting dawn. You're now listening to Part 4, Copenhagen, 1807. Tonight we enter a harbour of copper roofs and quiet canals, where a city sleeps under late summer skies until the sea brings a harsher lullaby. He arrives not as a single figure, but as the gathered memory of a capital, the creak of quay timbers, the faint tar sweetness of rigging, the clocks of churches that keep time for bakers and shipwrights, while out beyond the sound, silhouettes harden against the light, ships not come to trade but to insist. The beginning is simple, almost domestic. Stores of grain in warehouses, gun carriages under canvas, masts tied down against a sudden squall, mothers rinsing steps, apprentices chalking tallies on slate. Copenhagen wants nothing exotic from the morning. It wants to be left to the ordinary prosperity of a maritime city. Fish silvering the markets, rope laid true, ships built straight, a quiet pride in the fleet, anchored at rest. This is the wish at the city's heart, to keep its harbour as a cradle, not a trap. Yet beneath that modest desire lies an old anxiety, retied like rope. What happens when great empires quarrel, and a small kingdom stands between them like a sandbar between tides? Doubts steal in first as rumour, then as evidence, a British armament larger than any neighbourly visit, an ultimatum couched in the language of necessity, a fear that if Denmark will not hand over its fleet, others will take it by iron logic, the kind of logic that measures safety by how many enemy masts are neutralised before winter. In council rooms, the air grows close with maps and caution. In courtyards, soldiers drill with a seriousness that sounds like iron tapping iron. The city's private hesitations multiply. Are the walls strong enough? Are the guns well served? Is neutrality a cloak that the wind can simply lift away? A clerk running messages feels the unease like grit in a boot. An officer knows he must tell men to stand where masonry will someday be listed in ledgers of damage and repair. Even the water seems ambivalent. offering both the comfort of familiar channels and a broad, flat approach for bomb catchers that only need time and geometry to find their work. The shape of what stands against the city materializes with maritime patience, anchors dropped, boats lowered, lines squared, crews move in practice lattices, admirals consult by boat and lantern. The British intent, shaped by fear that Napoleon's long arm might one day reach the Danish fleet, grows into a grim resolve to remove the fleet as a factor, gently if possible, relentlessly if not. Their guns can arc fire over roofs, their mortars can plant flame like seeds. On shore, Copenhagen's defenders gather what steadiness they can. Artillerymen who know the recoil of their pieces as butchers know the weight of knives. Volunteers carrying buckets and hooks. A city clerk who has never prayed aloud, now folding a map and whispering the simplest words he remembers. The Navy, for all its pride, lies mostly at anchor. The question is not whether Danish sailors are brave, but whether bravery can lift a keel out of a ring of iron. And then the speaking begins, slow, emphatic sentences of fire drawn across the sky. A bomb's arc is an education in helplessness. It rises, it pauses as if thinking, and then it chooses an address. The first blossoms of impact are modest. Tiles, glass, a flurry of startled pigeons. But night teaches the shells to speak more fluently. Warehouses turn hollow-bellied. Courtyards find sudden stars lodged in their corners. Streets become corridors of embered air. The defenders answer where they can, batteries along the approaches trading blows with a fleet that keeps its distance like a schoolmaster, strict and practiced. Within the city, the labour is quieter and more intimate than war's usual pageantry. Bucket lines that glow in the orange light like beads, ladders step delicately between sparks, hands blackened by smoke finding the clean, small faces of children and steering them into safer rooms. The bell ropes grow hot, the canal water steams. A woman in a doorway wraps her shawl around a neighbour's baby without commentary, because there is no commentary to make when masonry falls like rain. Courage here finds prosaic tools. A baker's cart becomes an ambulance. A well that always tasted of iron becomes a beloved spring. Firewatchers learn the moods of drafts as if they were animals. Cinders that leap when a door opens. Flames that lie down briefly when a gust comes from the harbour. An old naval carpenter, hands like a map of work, pats a beam of a house and says, "Hold!" as if he can ask timber to behave like a friend. Some batteries do their part with stiff correct anger, sending heavy replies to silhouettes that remain aloof. It is a conversation across an ethical gulf, each side speaking necessity, each sentence made of powder and iron. The climax is not a charge, but an accumulation, the way rain becomes flood. By the third night, the city feels caught inside a bell being struck over and over, the air itself vibrating with the insistence that even neutrality has weight limits. There are moments when the rhythm bends favourably. A magazine does not go up because a door holds. A church roof sloughs sparks like a wet dog. A square that had rung with panic softens into a purposeful hush. The orderly chaos of water passed hand to hand, yet larger forces refuse to be shamed by small graces. The ultimatum returns, framed by new damage and new calculations about what can be risked tomorrow. In the rooms where leaders measure lives against symbols, a reluctant arithmetic pushes towards surrender, to save a city's people and stones by giving up the masts and yards that once defined its maritime pride. The decision, when it comes, feels like a pulled tooth felled across a whole jaw. It is both immediate and strangely distant, as if history has walked into the room, signed its name, and left the door swinging. The aftermath is not quiet so much as emptied of argument. Flames gutter and hiss. Streets are powdery with spent plaster. Benches serve as stretchers. The air smells of wet hemp and lime. Those who feared that yielding the fleet would unmake the kingdom stand in doorways and count blessings that cannot be tallied on naval lists. The living, the uncollapsed, the child asleep with soot on his cheek. Those who wanted to hold longer learned to shape their valour into survival work, stacking bricks, ladling soup, writing clean copies of reports with hands that still tremble. The British begin the melancholy task they had demanded, the taking of ships from a harbour that had cradled them, in a hush more akin to a funeral than to triumph. Sailors who might have fought each other at sea now pass lines and tally stores with a shared understanding that some necessities taste of ash, and yet even loss leaves a kind of scaffold on which futures can be built. Copenhagen's lesson settles with the ash that a small nation set between grand designs must practice the virtue of persistence in prose, not poetry, contract by contract, key by key, a sort of maritime stoicism. The fleets will matter again another year. Commerce will knit what war unpicked. A people who know how to mend sails also know how to mend streets. As night yields to a thinner, gentler dawn, the harbour shows its bones. Piles, stone, the patient geometry of docks. And he looks out across water that remembers everything and forgives nothing, and sees, as if in a ripple, an earlier battle still flickering in the city's memory. Smoke rolling low over the roads to Amager, signals that refuse to be read as caution, a one-eyed admiral leaning into history with a message that sounded like a heartbeat. The gulls circle without hierarchy, the masts stand like bare winter trees, and somewhere just beyond, the line where sea light brightens, the older year beckons, the Battle of Copenhagen 1801, waiting with its own lesson about closeness, nerve, and the stubborn grammar of a narrow channel. You're now listening to Part 5, Copenhagen 1801. The night draws close to a narrow road of water where ships breathe like sleeping animals, and a city waits to see whether nerve can outtalk numbers. He stands, meaning the memory of many men, on decks that smell of hemp and salt and old pine, while the Øresund lies quiet as a polished rail and the British line turns its slow, deliberate face toward the inner channel. The beginning is small and human, a boatswain's call clipped and clear, a kettle settling on a galley stove, a midshipman's hand trembling for an instant before it learns again to be useful. Copenhagen wishes only to keep its ships at anchor, and its choice is its own, but history has already entered the roadstead, Nelson with his squadrons, Parker with his caution, a nation of islanders measuring another nation of mariners with the hard arithmetic of necessity. Doubts tread the planks early. Is the outer line too thin? Are the hulks properly moored? Will the shoals protect or betray? Can the guns of Treckrona and the floating batteries write a sentence stout enough to be read through smoke? Will the Dannebrog at anchor behave like courage or like tinder? Far off bells ring for ordinary reasons. Here the hour gathers itself for harsher music. The antagonist is not malice but method, ships carrying gunnery drilled until it feels like breathing, captains who can read the wind as if it were a text they help to compose. Yet there are helps that fit snugly into the palm, pilots who know where the sound is only a skin over sand, gunners who can set elevation by feel, the old guardianship of reefs and shallows that have a local accent. The British slip inside the outer Prudence, turning left toward the anchored Danish line. The sun lifts pale and impartial, and then the guns begin to speak in pairs and triplets, a conversation in iron that refuses metaphor. A ship grounds, another slews, but most find their places with the sailors' stubborn patience. The channel narrows until choices become gestures, Luff, anchor, spring, heave round, run out, fire. The Danes, lashed to their moorings, answer with a steadiness that feels older than the century, work done against recoil, against fear's dry mouth, against the wandering of thought. Smoke presses down like a low ceiling, voices grow intimate shoulder to shoulder, words reduced to the language of tools, sponge, worm, round, now, again. Somewhere along the anchored line, a ship, named for the nation, carries more fire than wood can long forgive. She smoulders into a brightness no victory deserves to witness, and men leap into a water briefly speckled with flame. Ash drifts like soft snow. A priest's voice is lost and found in the wind. On the British side, good intentions and practiced aggression tangle. Flags speak, and one famous eye declines to read. An old theatre gesture that here feels less like swagger than a plea to let nerve do the work of luck. The battle climbs its slope carefully, then suddenly, then not at all. Moments slip into one another until time holds its breath. A cutter crosses with orders and does not return. A captain leans with his ship and becomes, for that second, another timber in the frame. Midday arrives thin and uncelebratory. Truces wave like handkerchiefs, uncertain, then steadier. Boats pull between lines that still twitch with readiness, carrying words heavier than shot. The result is not conquest in any singing sense. It is an extraction of promises and a lowering of flags, accomplished in a hush that recognises the closeness of skill on both sides. Copenhagen learns again the bruising virtue of compromise. Ships yielded or silenced so that the city might breathe tomorrow. A small nation's calculus set out where the sound can read it. Debris drifts, then settles. Ropes fall silent. The air loses its iron taste and begins to remember tar. Men who have shouted all morning speak softly, as if their throats have become churches. The afternoon opens like a window, cold, serviceable light over water that has done its witnessing and will now hold, in layers, the memory of masts and cries, and the patient, stubborn endurance of crews bound to anchors. And from that window the gaze carries outward again, farther back along the Baltic's rim, toward a cold theatre where winter made footnotes of rivers and bays, where a Danish admiral would teach the sea to echo a new cadence, Niels jewel, plying wits, and sail against a stronger foe. A broad bay near Køge, becoming a quiet anvil for a victory hammered without trumpet. The gulls tilt. The rigging ticks as it cools, and the page turns, unhurried, toward a summer of 1677 where craft and tide would meet like old friends and decide a nation's afternoon. You're now listening to Part 6, Køge Bay, 1677. Let the rigging hush, let the gulls draw slow circles. We're slipping into a wide pale bay where wind, tide, and patience decide more than thunder does. He stands, meaning many sailors, many quiet hands, on planks that smell of tar and sun-warmed pine, while the Danish line leans slightly to the swell, steady as a fence set against a wandering herd. The wish at the heart of this day is modest and exact. To keep the Baltic doorway in Danish keeping, to prove that craft and coastline can school a stronger foe into second thoughts. Doubts move early across the decks, like small shadows. Will the breeze hold? Will shoals, that wear green caps in certain weathers, betray their friends? Can signals thread cleanly through smoke? Do the guns bear true when the hulls begin to breathe harder? Out beyond, the opposing line gathers itself, brave ships with brave crews, sails like pale chests ready to fill, captains reading the morning as if it were a familiar chart, methodical, confident, sure that weight and number are arguments the sea must honour. And yet the bay has a memory, and the men who keep it have listened to that memory in winter calms and summer squalls. They know the long slant reach of the shoals. They know how the afternoon light turns soundings treacherous or kind. They know when to borrow the lee of the land, as if they were leaning into a friend's shoulder. Helps arrive in the ordinary forms that war sometimes forgets to praise. Pilots with hands as steady as chapel wood. Quartermasters who count cables by feel. Gunners who set elevation by the way their bones recognise recoil. Carpenters who can hear a seam's worry before it leaks. Signals creep up and down the masts like patient ivy. No shouting, only the grammar of flags and the measured answer of helms. Anchors go by the run and then are held with springs, so a ship may point her will without moving her feet. It is a kind of anchored dancing, this readiness, the fleet deciding where to fight before the fight decides for it. The adversary comes on, sails taking the light until the water seems set with glass. They mean to break the line, to make argument of iron and grape shot, to use breeze and broadside until geometry yields. But the Danish answer is a low, persistent hum of seamanship. The line is drawn just so, near enough to the shore that a careless thrust finds sand, open enough that guns may breathe. A captain trims an inch of canvas and changes the day's arithmetic. Another pays out cable by fathoms, measured to a memory, and quietly secures the weather gauge without the theatre of chase. The opening fire is not a parade, it is work. Guns speak in pairs, then in quick triplets. Crews move in a humane, practiced rhythm. Sponge, worm, round, run out, aim and breathe, and serve again. Smoke gathers and lays itself along the water like a shawl. Voices shorten to nouns and verbs. Men who have no taste for killing perform a craft that keeps their shipmates alive. Within that grey shawl, the battle's shape learns a Danish accent. The enemy, pressed toward shoals they do not love, loses, here and there, a strand of order. A ship heels too much to answer well. Another finds the ground and discovers that the sea can be just as stubborn at knee-deep as it fathoms. Danish broadsides arrive with the patient regularity of a metronome, not loud but exact, route by route cutting at the confidence of hull and crew. A flagship gestures, and the gesture becomes a small parade of advantage down the line. Here a half cable stolen, there a quarter point of helm that makes two batteries wake together. Courage is everywhere, and everywhere quiet. Boys carrying cartridges with their minds fixed on a single rung of ladder. Old mariners, setting their feet the way they always have when the deck begins to talk beneath them. A chaplain's lips move without sound. A surgeon's hands weigh decisions in bowls of water that tremble with every shot. The sea, impartial, receives everything and forgets nothing. A crest comes. There is always a crest, and it does not look like trumpet or banner. It looks like steadiness held one moment longer than an opponent expects. It looks like a captain judging to a heartbeat when to swing his ship on her springs, so a full tier of guns can speak into a mouth that thought itself safe. It looks like a pilot's finger laid softly on a chart, indicating a line only he truly sees. Pass here, not there. The opposing formation frays at its forward edge. Signals must do too much. Boldness finds itself tight on water it does not fully trust. A cheer never rises, only a thickening sense, plank by plank, that the day is learning a Danish lesson. The powder holds, the carriages keep their wheels. The rhythm repeats until the other rhythm falters, and then very gradually the bay grows wider for one fleet and narrower for the other. Guns slacken on the far line, not for lack of bravery, but for lack of options. A mast goes, first as a question, then as a certainty, and the air fills with the brief fabric sigh of sail yielding to gravity. A ship that hoped to turn finds herself heavy and unresponsive, as if the water has set a hand on her shoulder and said, "Stay." Another, proud and able, throws off her troubles and makes away with wounded dignity. No one begrudges it, for the sea is kind to survivors in ways land cannot understand. Among the Danish crews, the talk softens as thunder eases. Checks made, shot tallied, a bucket of water becoming more beautiful than any medal. Names are spoken and answered. Silence answers others. Flags, unhurried, change their grammar from command to care. The result is a shape felt more than announced. The bay is kept. The doorway remains Danish for another season. The wider war finds itself obliged to walk around a lesson taught without flourish. What lingers is not triumph's glitter, but the deeper warmth of competence. That knowledge passed from lip to lip and deck to deck, that a people close to a shoreline can ask their home warders to help and be answered. In the evening's thinned smoke, beams show their honest scars. The wind drops a key and moves down a register. Oars knock softly in boats moving between ships like kind thoughts. He looks aft along the line and sees not trophies but silhouettes, hulls growing quiet, masts painted darker against a rinsed sky. Crews who will sleep because they worked, not because they celebrated. As night combs the bay smooth, attention tacks inland. Beyond the bright fringe of water waits a different theatre where the wind bites the face and iron must be carried on shoulders, not in broadsides, fields frost-bitten, into iron, rivers learning the trick of bearing men, and a rendezvous where winter wrote its own severe terms. Lamp by lamp, the fleet dims, and in that hush, the mind walks ashore, north, into Scania, to a December plain where breath turns to lace, and two armies feel the earth harden under them. Somewhere in that still, glittering cold, a city named Lund lays out its streets like tight stitches, and the next page of our journey opens with the crunch of snow beneath boots and the dull, close thunder of men finding each other at arm's length in a winter that does not blink. You're now listening to Part 7, Lund, 1676. We step onto a plain of iron winter where breath turns to lace and each footfall answers with a brittle crystalline note. He stands, not a single soldier, but the gathered shape of an army, on frost-stiff ground north of Lund, in that hour before daylight chooses a colour, and the wish in their chests is simple as a cupped flame, to hold Scania's seam, to turn cold and courage into a sheltering wall. The snow has a faint crust that complains under boots. The Kevlinger River lies somewhere in the grey, pared thin by December. Low hedges appear and vanish like half-remembered lines in a psalm. Denmark's ranks breathe steadily, steam coiling from mouths and horse nostrils. They think of villages where lamps already burn low, and of fields that sleep honestly under winter, and their desire is to make this day a hinge that swings toward home. Yet doubts move early with the wind. The frost is friend and traitor, promising sure footing until it shatters. Powder clumps. Fingers argue with flint, and the opposing host, the Swedes, knit hard by their young king's resolve, waits in its own pale hush, geometry already written on the land. Staff officers draw narrow maps with gloved fingertips. Messengers blink against needles of ice. A drummer rubs his hands and finds a rhythm that keeps courage warm without waking fear. Out beyond the rim of breath, the adversary arranges itself with winter's efficiency. Swedish squadrons lean like dark reeds, cavalry restless under coats, infantry locked into tidy bricks of will. Dispatches whisper back and forth like moths that refuse to settle. There is no malice in the morning, only decision, the kind that strips ornament away. The Danes feel their inner weather shift. Memories of last year's bays and batteries are replaced by this quiet field where artillery's tongue must share space with steel. They wonder if anchors and springs have an equivalent in snow. But helps arrive, ordinary and saving. Old sergeants who can stand still without growing cold. Farriers whose hands make small miracles with stiff leather. Quartermasters who know which barrels haven't lied about being dry. A priest who will not scold the sky, but speaks softly of bread. The line is dressed, the files are counted, and the small bright understanding passes along the ranks that winter battles are not won by thunder, but by persistence, measured one bitter breath at a time. The first shots are almost polite, testing phrases across the white, little stings of powder that draw no blood from the day itself. Then the range tightens, the wind drops as if to listen, and fire takes on the low, repetitive cadence of work. Infantry trade volleys that sound like heavy carpets beaten in a courtyard. Cavalry edges forward, hooves finding the one truthful patch in every 10 steps. Guns bark in stubborn pairs. An orchard shivers and lets fall a sleeve of ice as if applauding no one. The inner struggle grows close. Numb feet, slow locks, the mind's dangerous wish to wander toward kitchens and hearths. Officers pass among companies, not with speeches but with the touch of a sleeve, a nod that turns men from drifting. The Swedes press where the ground hardens. The Danes answer where hedges give them narrow teeth. It is not a dance. No one in this cold will use that word, but there is a choreography all the same, traced by fatigue and taught by the land. Incline, refuse, step in, stand. Cavalry meets cavalry in a churn of hoarfrost and breath, sabres muted by mufflers, pistols loud as doors slammed in a quiet house. And for a blink, the field is a tapestry in motion, blue and white, and smoke-grey shapes waving, fraying, nodding again. A squadron that looked so sure 5 heartbeats ago suddenly rides through air where it expected ground. Another, thought spent, finds new legs under a captain whose voice remembers summer. On the flanks, small ditches become deep as canyons, and men discover the old intimacy of battle, faces nearer than the stories ever permit, the strange, almost affectionate detail of a foe's eyelash rhymed with frost just before the world chooses ruthlessness. The Kavlinger, thin but stubborn, edits manoeuvres with a single cool sentence. A bridge claims more attention than any banner. Somewhere in the midline, a standard dips, is caught, dips again. Hands that have learned to be tired refuse the lesson and lift. There are helps that do not carry rank. A drummer boy, too short for the wind's worst tricks, keeps the slow heartbeat that says together. A cart driver wedges his wheels just so and turns his small square of ground into a hinge. A private who has never spoken aloud in chapel says a useful thing in a quiet voice and sees 4 men breathe easier. A field piece slewed by sheer human insistence finds its angle, and 2 rounds placed without hurry retie a wobbling seam. Fear, when it arrives, is granular, domestic. Wet powder, stiff buckles, the terrible luxury of looking away for one blink too long, and is answered by other small domestics. A glove forced over a hand by a friend, a flask passed once and then put away, the clean imperative of a sergeant's eyes. The day climbs, not to a crest of noise, but to a cold clarity. Lines that have argued all morning must now choose nearness. The Swedes lean forward, with their king near enough to be a rumour. The Danes stiffen their files and let the river and hedges do half the talking. The collision is a slow crush, No heroic dash, only bodies, asked to be stone and then asked again. The snow darkens where it must. Signals stutter and resume. For a long minute, that seems an hour, the air forgets to move. Then the field's grammar changes by inches. A salient that promised much becomes a pocket. A wing that feared itself weak finds exact footing. A reserve lifts its head. The battle decides in the way winter decides, without flourish, with a tightening that snaps only when every fibre has said all it can say. When movement returns, it does so in lowered voices. The Swedes hold the field where it matters most. The Danes, having given a day's worth of iron willingness, yield their claim thread by thread and step back with the careful grace of men gathering the living. Defeat, if we call it that, wears a humane face. Surgeons steady hands beneath linen light. Officers count and count. Chaplains close eyes. No sermon has ever fully prepared them to close. And yet the wish that lit the morning does not go out. It exhausts itself into a banked ember that will travel, carried in carts, in the hollow of helmets, in the deep pockets of resolve, to other shores and other arrangements of ground. Scania's lesson, how winter lends courage its own austerity, will not be mislaid. Evening lowers its veil, gentle despite what it has witnessed. The plain regains its colourless honesty. Hooves stop talking, a last volley echoes, and then becomes part of the weather. He, meaning the memory of all who stood, looks south and west, where ice loosens its grip on salt water, where islands sit like folded coats upon a bench. There, beyond this tight-lipped land, the Baltic draws threads into a braid of straits and belts. There on Finn, a town called Nyborg holds streets that know the sound of boots and the bright, hard answer of counterstroke. Lamps begin to stipple the distance. A gull lifts from the frozen stubble and turns toward darker water. And in that slow blue hour, when frost and smoke look like the same shawl, the story gathers itself quietly for a crossing to an island where banners will tilt into wind and a winter's grief will look for a way to become resolve. You're now listening to Part 8, Nyborg, 1659. We step onto the island of Finn, where hedgerows smell faintly of salt and winter apples, and a small harbour town steadies itself for a turning of the tide. He stands, not one soldier, but the gathered breath of a coalition, along damp lanes that run toward Nyborg's walls, the ground spongy with recent rain, the air tasting of brine and wood smoke. The origin of this part is humble: fields, ditches, and a town whose name is spoken softly by sailors and teamsters alike. Yet from such modest beginnings a hinge is made. Denmark wishes for the simplest of restorations, to drive winter from the threshold, to fold back the Swedish reach that is spread like frost down a window pane. In the bones of the men, landing and marching, there is a compact longing to prove that islands can be taken back the way a family reclaims a room in its own house, carefully, steadily, without breaking what must hold them tomorrow. They picture stoves lit again and shutters mended. They picture the ferry bells resuming their unremarkable music. That is all. And yet under those wishes, doubts stir like eels in shallow water. Coalition commands must agree. Roads are narrow. The sea's help is a weathered friend who comes and goes as it pleases. And somewhere beyond the rise, the Swedes have their own clean arithmetic, laid out in files and gun positions. Out in that pale guarded distance, the opponent is tidy and seasoned, Swedish ranks cut to winter's pattern, officers measuring distances with a glance, batteries posted where hedgerows become sudden teeth. They are not villains, they are a hard wind from another quarter, intent on keeping what has been taken. The island itself behaves neither as enemy nor friend. Pastures that welcome hooves also conceal soft patches. Ditches that invite defence hinder advance, if read with the wrong grammar. The inner struggle among the Allied troops are a braid of Danish heart, Dutch seamanship, Brandenburg grit, Titans early. Will signals thread cleanly through so many accents? Will prudence temper zeal without quenching it? Are the provisions enough when marches are longer on the ground than on a map? A captain folds his worry into neat actions, checking flints, whispering to a frightened horse, tapping a wheel with the tenderness a carpenter gives to furniture he intends to hand down. There are helpers, modest and significant, island folk who know which meadow drains first after rain, a ferryman who can tell by the taste of the wind how long a squall will busy itself, Dutch mariners whose boats seem to read shoals like old letters, Brandenburg dragoons who treat mud as just another substance to be carried. A chaplain, voice hoarse from salt air, chooses a short blessing over a long one. Quartermasters, grave and practical, have managed to produce bread that is merely heavy, not impossible. These are the small hinges on which larger doors swing. The coalition forms, adjusts by half companies and heartbeats, and turns its attention toward the town that gives the day its name. The opening of battle is not a flourish, but a slow knitting. Skirmishes test the seams of hedges. Guns clear their throats and begin to speak in low, regular sentences. The wet air turns powder smell into something like bitter tea. The town appears and disappears behind folds of ground. Its steeple pricks the grey. Its ditch glints like a tight-lipped smile. The Danes carry the wish for home in their shoulders. The Dutch bring a sea-borne competence ashore, ropes used now to haul guns where wheels falter. The Brandenburgers add a straight-ahead willingness that treats difficulty as a thing to be waded and dragged. Doubts insist. Coalition lines might fray where language does not quite meet. A bold push could outpace support. The enemy is not a rumour, but a wall that answers. Orders travel by gesture. A hand opens, extend, a hand closes, hold. The island watches, old and patient, recording every footfall with a squelch. What stands against them hardens as noon approaches. Swedish volleys cut hedge tops. Their field pieces place shells with the spare elegance of a schoolmaster's chalk. Countercharges nip like winter dogs at the ankles of any unit that dares to hurry. For long minutes that feel like a low tide, refusing to turn, the coalition breathes and sets its feet, trading iron for yards. A barn burns without asking permission. A willow splits and hangs its crown like wet hair. A lane becomes a funnel of smoke where men recognize each other by voice more than by face. Inside that closeness, the inner quarrel is constant. The desire to run ahead, the duty to stay stitched to a neighbour, fears sand in the mouth, courage's slow household tone. Load, level, fire, breathe. A helps arrive where planning pauses. A Dutch captain rotates companies as smoothly as reefing a sail. A Danish battery finds, with a carpenter's intuition, the one stretch of firmer earth from which its wheels will not sink. Brandenburg troopers dismount into a waist-high ditch and make, out of clumsy circumstance, a serviceable rampart. A runner falls, another picks up the word without ceremony. A drummer chooses the slow stroke that says we are still a body, even when the body must bend. Somewhere along the hedgerow, a standard leans forward, and the line refuses to let it tip. Hands it will never meet again. Hold it up together. The battle's temperature climbs without theatrics, only the long, low press of men and will. The crest, when it comes, is almost shy. A coordinated shove unzips a section of defence. A crossroads, muddy, unimpressive, becomes a key slipped into a lock. A battery labouring on a knoll finally finds the angle that speaks directly, into the Swedish centre. Resistance folds not in disgrace but in exhaustion. Disgrace. The Swedes, who have given the island a stern education, begin to step back in the correct, careful way of good troops. Pockets of fight continue like embers in a windbreak, and then go dark, not in surrender so much as in acceptance that the day has chosen an author. The coalition collects breath, gathers the scattered, and discovers that the rumour on which it marched, Nyborg can be retaken, has turned into a fact steady enough to lean on. After, the light seems cleaner. Townsfolk appear as if conjured by the smell of cooling iron. Doors open onto courtyards full of relieved untidiness. Our well gives back its familiar slap and echo. The victors speak softly because triumph near houses sounds impolite. Surgeons fold linen with reverence. Officers write. Chaplains listen. The island, relieved, resumes its domestic grammar, nets, stables, the creak of a cart, overlaying the day's harsher vocabulary without quite erasing it. The result is as much moral as military. The coalition, stubborn and diverse, has proven that Denmark's map can be redrawn toward home. The sea lanes that brought help can carry hope again. The winter that took will have to give something back. And yet no one mistakes this for an ending. Out beyond Finn, across belts and sounds that know both mercy and mischief, a capital lowers its lamps and hears the snow-stiff tread of a besieger. The Swedish ambition, pressed here, still leans against Copenhagen's walls, a storm attempted, a city that remembers how to count its stones and choose its breath. And as night slides over Nyborg, the harbour lies like dark glass. Masts make thin scratches on the first stars. Somewhere a ferry chain knocks twice, then stills. He looks east, where the ice will thicken, and the moon will pour its white counsel over rampart and roof. In that quiet, the next page lifts like a shutter, the winter assault on Copenhagen. Ladders, grapnels, the long-held breath of a city, deciding how much it can refuse. You're now listening to Part 9, Assault on Copenhagen, 1659. Snow thickens the air, ladders whisper against stone, and a city holds its breath beneath a winter moon. He stands, not one defender, but the gathered will of a capital, upon the scarp where drifted snow has learned the shape of parapets, and the wish in his chest is almost domestic in its simplicity. Keep the lamps lit in the windows behind him, keep the rooms warm, keep the bell towers counting hours that belong to bakers and children, not to sieges. Wind comes off the Øresund with a clean blade. Ice moans far out along the roads of water. Within the walls, men and women in thick coats pass cartridges and pails as if they were loaves, while the ramparts receive a last quick straightening, gabions shouldered in, fascines tamped, fuses checked with gloved patience. Copenhagen asks for what cities always ask when history presses close: time and the right to spend it in ordinary ways. Beneath that prayer, doubts rustle like straw. The storm could use the ice as a bridge. The ladders, muffled with rags, might arrive before the alarm ripens. The garrison is brave but tired. Citizens are willing but new to discipline. And the enemy, beyond the glaciers. Swedish columns, exact and intent, has read enough winters to know how to write with them. Across the whitened field, the opposing will arranges itself with the schoolmaster's clarity, files that look like charcoal lines on a clean page, pioneers with bundles carried low, officers whose swords are not for flourish, but for pointing the knight toward walls. They do not hate the city. They mean to move a war from stalemate into statement, to step across ice and parapet and make the capital a conclusion. Weather, indifferent but conversational, favours stealth. Snow's soft grammar muffles boots. A sky without stars refuses to tattle, and the batteries along the approaches must feel for shapes rather than see them. Inside the breast of the defenders, the inner quarrel gathers. What if the first rush breaches? What if the cry that should rouse a quarter finds only pillows and fear? What if the powder sulks? What if the king's vow, here he will stand, must be measured in streets as well as in councils? Helps arrive in the human scale that sieges teach. Students, sober with purpose, shoulder muskets that still smell faintly of oil. Guildsmen bring their steady hands to the business of fuse and nail. Sailors who know the sound like a set of family stories handle traversing gear the way they handle capstans. A chaplain moves without sermon, setting his palm briefly on cold shoulders, as if to tell bones they are not alone. On the earthworks, veterans look for angles, not speeches, and find them. The harbour's dark water holds Dutch hulls, like parenthesis, supplies, and courage, already landed in earlier days, a memory warming this snow-chilled hour. Even the wind bends once or twice and throws smoke back toward the plain, as if indulging a small preference for roofs and hearths. The assault breaks the quiet with a needle rather than a hammer. A rocket scrawls a brief green mark. Somewhere, a drum keeps time under a blanket. Then ladders lift and float forward on many hands, their rungs counted in breath. The first shots from the parapet are clear, careful and few. They are not meant to blaze, but to wake. Bells answer, some bronzy, some cracked by winter, sending the alarm in widening rings through courtyards and lofts. The enemy comes on well. Pioneers lay fascines into the ditch. Storming parties climb into the cold geometry of angles and fire. The city's lower edges are suddenly a country of ropes and hooks and shouted names. At the wall, nearness does the strange work it always does to time. Seconds become rooms where a life can fit and still find space for a thought, a prayer, a memory of bread. Doubts lose their footing under the weight of habit and neighbourliness. Women hand up powder as if feeding a stove. Boys run with messages between embrasures, choosing the safe shadows as if playing in alleys they have always known. An old shipwright, placed by chance, where a scaling ladder seeks purchase, swings a mallet with the same exactness he once used to set a keel. A gunner who has not slept properly in 3 nights sights low and breathes, and the gun breathes with him. Its recoil is the one predictable thing in a room full of moving surprises. Each bastion becomes a village, its lanes lit by muzzle flash, its corners defended by men who say each other's names like orders. Outside, discipline pays for courage. A Swedish party reaches a crest and is irised by a sudden light. Another makes the ditch a road and learns how narrow roads can be when they are watched. Grapnels bite where old brick says no, and then slide away when hands above find the right rhythm. The wall answers not only with shot but with a rain of the city's own inventions. Stones, sand, water turned to knives by the temperature. A banner leans. Hands under it refuse to let it fall into the ditch. More hands relieve them, and the cloth continues to mean. Frederick's presence, close enough to be rumour, and then to be seen, firm, heavy coat, a face set not in defiance, but in steadiness, adds a gravity that powder alone cannot supply. He does not perform. He stands, and standing, lends the cold a warmer centre. The crest of night comes neither early nor late, but exactly when the city's muscles are ready to hold it. On the most threatened point, a reserve that doubted its own timing arrives in the precise minute when doubt must leave. On another, a sally door opens and closes like a discreet breath, spilling out a handful of men who make a much larger noise than their number deserves. The ladders begin to tilt backward more often than forward. Commanders in the snow-laden dark exchange glances with the kind of respect that says, "We are taught by this, even now." The assault, designed for the decisiveness of ice, discovers that stone and people have thicker winters inside them. Withdrawal is not collapse, it is a cold, correct act, performed under a sky that will not help. The ditch gives back its burden, ladders slide, litters appear, where shouts thin into quiet. On the parapets, Copenhagen's defenders do not exult. They count, they tend, they look down and then look away. The bells, having done their fierce work, lower their voices. The city breathes, the long shaky exhale that follows a held breath, and in that breath a lesson settles like snow in a still hallway, that citizens, soldiers and sea can make a single body when the map forces them into one skin. Morning has the washed look of linen hung in winter sun. Fires that were kept small all night grow modestly, enough for broth. Streets show footprints that will be swept and then remembered. The king's vow, whatever words one chooses to give it, has found its architecture in people rather than proclamations. The result is not vainglory. It is permission for ordinary life to resume its humble dominion. Bakeries, menders, ledger books. Yet memory, like frost, keeps its patterns on the glass. The sound lies beyond, grey and useful, recalling other winters when Denmark's fate turned on water rather than walls, earlier days when a broad, shallow sea demanded seamanship instead of ladders, when guns spoke from decks and shoals kept their own counsel. As the sun lifts a little and the smoke thins into blue, he, meaning the shape of all who stood this night, lets his gaze travel out over the roadstead, where gulls write pale sentences no decision can erase. Far off, the Baltic holds an older summer's echo. A day when sails filled above a low coast, when a fleet learned to use a shoreline like a second rudder, when cannon smoke lay upon green water like a patient shore. The page turns softly in that direction, towards 1644, and a fight named for a strip of sea, Kohlberger Heide, where timbers spoke, and wind, and the quiet craft of pilots who could feel a shoal with the bones of their feet. You're now listening to Part 10, Kohlberger Heide, 1644. Let the shoreline lie low and patient. The wind draw a slow line along the Baltic, and the water remember every keel that has ever trusted it. He stands, meaning many sailors, in the dim wash of early light off the Holstein coast, where the sea wears a thin haze, and the land keeps its counsel, and the wish that murmurs through the decks is unadorned. Keep Denmark's road open. Match a stronger foe with better seamanship. Let this strip of green-grey water answer kindly to those who know its grammar. On board the Danish ships, there is the domestic music of readiness, the creak of blocks, the mild complaint of rope under strain, the clink of mugs set aside as stations are taken. Men think of harbours where children lean over quays and count gulls, of fields that meet the sea without argument. They wish quietly that after today those harbours and fields will not have to learn a new flag. Yet doubts pace the planks with equal patience. The enemy comes with weight. Swedish hulls taut with confidence. Gunnery as drilled as a catechism. Captains whose eyes write quick sums in wind and distance. Will the breeze hold steady? Will the shoals favour home or stranger? Will signals carry through the smoke when speech becomes iron and flame? The water here is helpful and treacherous in the same breath. Broad where it looks narrow, narrow where the charts say breadth, with sand that remembers old storms and moves its borders in the night. A pilot tests the air with his cheek. A gun captain runs his palm along a barrel as if greeting an old friend at a doorway. A chaplain says no more than a few careful words about courage being mostly habit Even the gulls seem to circle more deliberately, as if the day must be counted rather than sung. Out beyond, the Swedish line forms with courteous menace, sails trimmed to the small advantage that multiplies into larger ones once the guns begin. Their intent is simple and stern, to press the Danish fleet off its water, to make the Baltic's midriff answer to Stockholm's will. The Danish answer is not volume but placement, anchors laid with thought, springs set so that ships may speak their broadsides without spending their footing, yards trimmed to the spare geometry the coast allows. Helps arrive in ordinary clothes, quartermasters whose fingers remember the weight of a fathom, helmsmen who feel a shift in wind before the telltales confess it, carpenters who can listen to a seam and tell whether it worries. The fleet breathes together, human and timber, and the shoals lean near like quiet allies who prefer to show, not tell. The first exchanges are respectful, like professionals meeting at a line they both understand. Guns open in pairs, then in disciplined triplets. Smoke folds down, ripples, and begins to lie along the water like a patient shawl. Orders shrink to verbs. Bear, heave, fire. Hold. Across the swells, the enemy's salvos come with the neatness of schooling. The Danish reply is less adorned, more local, angles stolen from shoreline, pauses chosen by tide. The inner struggle tightens on every deck. Fear's dry mouth, the mind's urge to look at the trouble rather than through it. The temptation to hurry the way unpracticed hands hurry knots and only make them worse. Habit answers. Sponges move with the rhythm of heartbeats. Cartridges pass hand to hand. Elevation is set by eyes that have watched waves for years. Within the haze, the battle finds its character. A Swedish ship, confident and pressing, discovers the sea's second language when a keel kisses sand. Not cruelly, but enough to turn a sentence into a stutter. A Danish captain, who learned this coast by winter stars, pays out one more fathom on his spring and turns his broadside as if opening a window at the exact right moment to let heat out and light in. The tear speaks, measured and low, and the air accepts what it is given. Elsewhere a gust lifts, a topsail flogs once, then is quiet. A gun bursts and is forgiven by the men who served it, their hands already on the next piece. The fleet's nerves are shoal sharp. Trim a point, steal a cable's length. Let the opponent think you are anchored harder than you are, and then breathe the hull a finger toward favour when his smoke hides his certainty. This is not thunder for its own sake. It is carpentry done with iron, fitting blows into joints the sea and shoreline help to cut. Courage does not present itself as drama, it keeps to work. A powder boy with wrists like reeds takes the long way around a heated patch of deck because someone wiser told him once that haste has a price. The ship thanks him by not making him pay it. A boatswain's call, 2 notes, plain, threads a lane through noise and finds the ears it needs. A surgeon's basin trembles and settles and trembles again. He moves with the same carefulness he would give to a child's splinter. The admiral stands just far enough forward that his voice reaches, just far enough aft that the ship still breathes. His orders are the size of a man's mouth, not the sky's, and yet the line listens like timber, listens for a mortise. There is a crest, as there always is, and it arrives not as spectacle but as a minute held taut. The Swedish push leans hardest. 2 Danish ships, set like knitting needles between water and land, hold against it, springs groaning, guns answering with the steadiness of a clock that refuses to be hurried. The range is so near that planks and faces appear and vanish within the pulse of smoke. A mast goes, not ours, then a yard carried away, and a cheer that nobody quite hears. Signals climb and change and are understood. The enemy, pressed towards skinny water where confidence thins, checks, dresses its line anew. The day, taking that breath, changes slope. Not by shout, but by a general exhale along the Danish decks. Men understand they have given the sea the right answers, often enough that the sea is answering back in kind. The result is not a banner to hang over a city gate. It is a keeping. The Kohlberger Heide remains Denmark's speaking place for another season. Cables narrow the world to a manageable shape. The coast resumes its role as partner rather than witness. The Swedish fleet, brave and able, draws off with the correctness good sailors owe each other. There is respect in the way guns fall silent, an old courtesy of the sea that says we have measured one another and will do so again. On the Danish decks, voices return to human register. Buckets move. A prayer is said without flourish. Someone laughs once, briefly, at nothing at all, and the sound spreads like warmth down a cold corridor. Afternoon shows the colour of the water more honestly. Splinters are swept, lines are bent anew, cooks coax something patient from iron pots. The men glance toward the low coast and think, each in his way, of wharves and windows and the exact size of bread. What has been won is a right to continue. Sail tomorrow, convoy next week. Tell a child that the sea is still ours to read. And in the quiet after, when the rigging ticks as it cools, and gulls begin to sketch their loose punctuation again, attention draws eastward along the chart's narrow throat. There is another strait where the water pinches tight and traffic must pass single file, a belt named for an island and a shoal. There, before this same year is out, the lines will meet again in closer quarters. Hulls almost within speaking distance, cartridges moving as fast as hands can keep a promise. The sea turned into a tunnel of smoke and echo. He looks toward that seam in the map, where tides knead sand into new shapes between one tide and the next, and the story bends, unhurried, toward Fehmarn Belt. You're now listening to Part 11, Fehmarn Belt, 1644. We enter a narrow seam of water where ships pass close enough to hear each other breathe, and the day learns to speak in short, careful sentences of wind and iron. He stands as the shape of many sailors on a deck that smells of tar and wet hemp, where the belt draws itself thin between shoal and shore, and the wish moving along the planks is modest and exact, to keep this throat of the Baltic open in Danish keeping, to meet weight with placement, bravado with seamanship, and to return at dusk with masts still counting the sky. Doubts, early and honest, pace beside that wish. The channels here are string tight, the shoals repainted by each season's weather, the enemy's numbers good, their gunnery drilled until it feels like muscle rather than memory. A boatswain's call trims the ship's nerves. Pilots with winter-salted hands murmur soundings as if speaking to old stones. A chaplain folds his prayer small enough to fit in a pocket. May our work be careful. Out beyond the pale water, the opposing line settles into tidy menace, sails drawing like lungs made of linen, yards squared to make argument of iron. The belt itself behaves like a stern tutor. It gives no extra space for error. It demands slow rudders and quick minds. It turns smoke into walls and echoes into tricks of distance. Helps arrive in human scale. Quartermasters who count cable by feel. Gun captains who can set elevation from the remembered height of last winter's door lintel. A surgeon who lays out his linen with the same care he would use for a child's Sunday shirt. Anchors bite. Springs are led. The hull takes its stance, as if planting its feet on a narrow stair. The first speaking is close and plain. Guns answer in pairs, then in curt triplets. The sea takes each blow and lays it down in ripples that tap the neighbouring planks like knuckles on a table. Within the haze, faces come and go at a human distance. No grand theatre, only work. Sponge, worm, round. In, out. The recoil climbing the bones like a remembered ache. Fear arrives as dryness in the mouth and is cured by habit. Haste knocks once and is denied a second time by a petty officer's steady hand on a shoulder. A Swedish ship, pressing hard to cut the lane, heels towards skinny water and discovers the belt's older grammar. Her guns speak hurriedly, then with less confidence, and a Danish broadside, turned on a spring with the neatness of opening a door to let in a precise gust, answers with the patience of carpentry. Elsewhere, a gust changes its opinion, canvas slats, a yard goes with a ragged sigh, and men move, as they always have moved, valuing hands over noise. The battle tightens until wind and smoke, and will feel like the same fabric pulled taut. Signals climb and are understood because the fleet has learned each other's shorthand in harsher weather than this. There are allies, no chart marks. A low bank on Lolland throws the wind back in a way that only the old pilots expect. A seam of darker water tells a helmsman where the channel leans. A gull's sudden lift warns of a bar's fainting edge. Courage keeps humble instruments. A powder boy runs the longer path because it's safer, and the ship thanks him by still breathing. A carpenter plugs a wounded seam with a mallet's quiet syllable. A marine with powder-smudged cheek sights along a barrel and breathes out a prayer not for victory, but for steadiness. The enemy is gallant, their salvos clean. Their captains read water like numbers and press when numbers say press. But the belt refuses to be only arithmetic. It remembers who learned it slowly, on winter days, when nothing happened but understanding. The crest of the day is a minute you could cup in your hands. 2 Danish ships set like bookends on the lanes swing on their springs, the width of a breath, and open both tiers into an approach that thought itself safe. The air flinches, then settles. Across the narrow water, a flagship signal gestures for repair and courage in the same cloth. Answers come, brave and efficient, but the geometry of advantage has shifted by inches that cannot be unmade. A mast gives a sound like an oath torn in half, and canvas folds with a tired dignity that makes no one cheer. Boats dart like blunt swallows carrying the small freight of words that save minutes. Hold, ease, now. The belt hums with iron talk, then lowers its voice as the opposing line, still proud, begins to choose distance over insistence, finding in prudence a shape of honour that good sailors recognise. Result here is kept rather than claimed. The lane remains ours to speak. Convoy and message may pass. The winter ahead will have fewer sharp teeth for those who live by sea's temper. On the Danish decks, the noise thins to the dear domesticities of survival. Buckets sloshing, a kettle set back on a ring, a laugh that escapes before a man remembers to save it for later. Surgeons wash, carpenters count. A chaplain ties off his last strip of bandage and looks at the sky as if reading a quiet line. No trumpet, only the relief that competence has been enough where greatness was not required. The belt shows itself again as water rather than argument, green-grey, serious, forgiving in its own slow way. And yet the day does not end at sea. The eyes of those who have kept the lane tilt toward land, toward shores, where wars continue in other grammars. Eastward and south across years, the map lifts a page to another winter, and a field where cavalry breath smokes and hedges turn into teeth. North again, across decades, it points to a bluff above a narrow fjord, Heligoland, where boats will nose into a pocket of water and cut the seams of an enemy's lifeline with quiet exactness. Later still, it draws the gaze to other ramparts and other relief, Fredericia before dawn, Isted under rain, each a different voice of the same desire. Keep a home-sized corner of the world. As evening calms the belt into a sheet of worn silk, he, being all who stood the day, looks along the coast where pines lean and farms keep their low courage, and the story inclines toward that cliffed inlet in 1716, where oars will move without splash, where powder will be found and silenced, and where a small fjord will teach a lesson in how to unmake a siege by touching one careful thread. You're now listening to Part 12, Helsingborg, 1710. A grey winter light settles over Scania's shore, and a city on a bluff waits, while two histories, once tangled, draw close enough to hear each other breathe. He stands, not one man, but the gathered steadiness of an army newly returned to old ground, on the approaches to Helsingborg, where fields roll in cold folds toward the town, and the Öresund rests like a strip of dulled silver. The origin of this part is spare and human, Denmark asking to come home to Scania, to reclaim hedgerows that remember Danish footsteps, to make the water between Helsingør and Helsingborg feel again like a friendly hallway rather than a guarded door. In the ranks there is a wish so compact it fits in a mittened hand. Let this day unfasten a knot tied by years of loss. Let houses with red roofs and narrow chimneys see our colours and be unafraid. They picture ferries gliding again, markets speaking both sides, old phrases without bristle, a shoreline that does not wince when it hears drums. Yet doubts come early, as they always do when the ground is familiar, but the century has turned. The Swedes have had time to make this bank their own. Powder clumps in the damp. Maps argue with reality, and the wind carries a rumour that good intentions are still only intentions until the first volley proves them. Beyond the field where frost whitens stubble, the opposition arranges itself with a lean competence, Swedish infantry knitted into bristling lines, cavalry poised like ink strokes across a page, guns placed where the undulation of the land teaches them a quiet geometry. There is no malice in their steadiness. There is the same hard wish, reversed. Keep what is held. Deny the crossing a storybook ending. Prove that memory alone cannot move borders. The inner struggle moves through Danish files like a small cold draft. Some veterans know Scania's lanes by childhood. Others have only learned them from talk. Officers must convert a warm idea into measured steps. Supplies lag by minutes that feel like hours. A chaplain speaks briefly of bread. An old sergeant tightens buckles and says nothing at all. A drummer tries his sticks on a rim to find a pulse that is strong without being fast. Helps arrive in modest shapes. Farmers point with gloved hands toward ground that carries horse without theft. A pilot of the sound now walks among infantry and reads the slopes as he once read currents. A courier remembers a sheep track that makes a smoother arc than the road. When the day begins to talk in iron, it does so first in testing syllables, pickets brushed aside, skirmish lines probing hedges that suddenly grow thorns. Then the grammar thickens, volleys flatten air into hard pains, batteries swap slow, heavy words. The town's church spire holds its dark triangle in the pale sky like a needle that has already sewn the names of past days into a tapestry. Now it watches new thread. Danish files dress, refuse, and lean. Swedish counterweights answer, steady and stern. A slope that promised advantage proves to be a shelf. A damp hollow triples the weight of a man's stride. Inside each rib cage, the quieter battle ticks. Don't hurry, don't think about warmth. Don't let the mind wander into rooms where pots simmer. Officers pass with that small important touch, a sleeve caught, a shoulder steadied, that turns a crowd into a line again. Cavalry feels the field's intentions first, hooves crumping through crusted frost, then slipping where sod remembers yesterday's thaw. Squadrons meet in a close, breathy clatter, no grand dash, only short, corrective bursts, sabres that look like pale fish as they rise and fall in the winter light. The infantry's trade returns to its old, relentless cadence, load, level, fire. And in the pause, the mind shrinks to a single useful thing, ramrod smooth, flint dry, mouth closed, against the sour powder. A lane bordered by willow becomes a funnel where companies are measured and found true or wanting. The Swedes keep their line taut, their volleys speak with the crispness of schoolroom recitation. Their guns solder Danish progress into smaller and smaller pieces. An advance that felt like a promise at sunrise begins to feel like a debt note at noon. Yet steadiness is its own ally. A Danish battery finds dry footing and begins to place its sentences with patient clarity. A regiment, stung and tempted to fray, remembers practice and ties itself back together on a hedgerow's low spine. A standard dips, is caught, and becomes a hinge around which men decide that staying is braver than going. A captain who knows when not to speak simply points, and 100 feet obey an angle that keeps them alive. These are not the gestures that make paintings. They are the ones that let children meet fathers after. Even so, the field's broader logic asserts itself. The Swedish line, handled by men who know this county the way fishermen know their stretch of sea, leans where it hurts most to be leaned against. Counterfire scours the Danish right. A mounted reserve arrives exactly when the day could have been turned and says gently and decisively, no. The crest is not a surge but a cooling. Momentum loses its temperature. Orders to hold become orders to gather. The map's hopeful arrows lose their colour under breath-clouded light. Helsingborg, so near that voices seem almost to carry to its houses, remains a city seen rather than entered. Retreat, never a word the heart chooses, must be translated into acts that have dignity. Files that step backward without becoming scattered brush, guns limbered with the careful anger of carpenters whose work is not finished but must be stopped. Surgeons open their kits in doorways, chaplains spare words on the road. Quartermasters, those secular saints of continuance, count what can be counted and keep books that will be needed tomorrow as surely as bread. The result is a lesson without brass, that homecoming across a strait requires more than courage and memory. It requires a day whose weather and geometry agree to help. Denmark does not win Scania back at Helsingborg. It wins instead a correctness about what can be held and what must be postponed. The wish that brought them sharp in the morning dims into an ember that will not go out. Keep the sound open, keep the island sure, let prudence be a shepherd that leads courage where it can graze and not be harmed. As the light thins, the field's noises lower to domestic registers, cartwheels, harness buckles, the soft grammar of counting. On the bluff above the town, windows begin to show small squares of amber. Somewhere a pot lid rattles, indifferently, at a boil. The sea breathes below, unchanged in its long verbs, and when the evening places its cool hand on every brow, the gaze, his gaze, their gaze, slips north along the Bohuslän coast to a small fjord tucked into rocks like a safe pocket. There in a summer 2 years hence, oars will move like held breaths, and a flotilla will thread into water the enemy thinks private. Powder and shot will be found and made to go quiet. A siege will discover it has been holding a rope that someone else can cut with one exacting stroke. The inlet is named Heligoland. In its narrow, echoing stillness, the next page waits. listening. You're now listening to Part 13, Heligoland, 1716. Tonight we slip into a narrow fjord tucked among grey rocks, where oars move like quiet breaths and a siege far away forgets, for a fateful hour, that lifelines can be cut. He stands, not a single raider, but the collected hush of a flotilla, at the prow of a low boat, gliding beneath cliffs combed by wind and gulls, the water ink-dark and almost still, and the wish within every rib cage is modest and exact, to unlace the enemy's larder without waking the camp, to turn barrels and cartridges into silence, to let strategy bow its head before seamanship. To those who row, Heligoland feels less like a place than a listening, one inlet, one thread, and if the thread is severed, a larger tapestry loosens. That is the origin of this chapter. Doubt travels with them in familiar shapes. A cove can amplify a clatter. A lookout might yawn and still see enough. Wind could lift and tattletale along the oarlocks. A single miscounted bend could set boats against stone. The adversary is patient and practical. Storeships and escorts tucked in the crease of rock and pine, powder layered away from sparks, officers whose charts have the confident smudge of long use. Beyond the headland, a king's ambition has pitched its tents against a city. Here in the fjord, its stomach sleeps lightly, helps arrive without trumpet. Pilots who have read this coast in winter and can hear the change in depth through the oar, men who tie off a boat in one smooth kindness of rope, a petty officer whose palm settles a nervous wrist as if quiet could be lent hand to hand. The approach is an exercise in understatement. Oars muffled, blades entered like thoughts, orders shaped by fingertip and eye, hulls shadowing the cliff's own darker line. When the first anchor cable is touched, it feels like touching a vein. A lantern moves on a deck ahead and then goes still. Someone laughs softly and is shushed by sleep, not suspicion. The raiders arrive as a weather change, nothing to see until everything is different. The opening is work, not fury. Grapnels lay hold, without clatter. Men step up, as if onto their own thresholds. A guard turns and finds a face so near that both are briefly astonished by the ordinary fact of breath. Then iron speaks in close grammar, pistols at touching range, blades used like short sentences, and the stored thunder of powder, still in barrels and kegs, becomes a hostage to a spark that never arrives because careful hands forbid it. The inner struggle, always there, hums. Do not hurry, do not preach to the minutes, count what must be sent to the deep and what must be towed. Remember that victory here is measured in emptiness left behind. Around them, the fjord answers with its own quiet echoes that fold quickly, water that receives without complaint, pine tops that barely note the change. The escorts rally with a good sailor's anger. They try to widen the inlet by will alone, to make room where there is none, and for a few taut heartbeats the air is stitched with swivel gun sparks and the blunt music of boarding. A mast groans, a yard gives, a boat shoulders a hull like a stubborn mule, and then the rhythm returns to the raiders, the discipline of small, exact acts. Fuses disappear, bung staves thump, kegs roll in a controlled, domesticated way toward a choice, scuttle or seize. A gunner who will never be named tests a barrel head with his knuckles and decides, this one to the boats, that one to the dark. Courage keeps prosaic instruments, a marline spike, a wet mitten on a hot touch hole, a whispered number that ensures two men lift together and nobody slips. The enemy is not shamed by the inlet. They strike, they call, they try the hard geometry of narrow water with the same competence that would serve them anywhere else. But Heligoland is a teacher with few words. It tells them that width is a resource, and that tonight others control it. The crest of the raid is almost modest, no trumpet, only a sufficiency reached. Lines pay out, kegs vanish, a brig staggers with her cargo gone slack. An escort's deck is cleared of purpose, and somewhere beyond the headland a siege clock loses a tooth. It did not know it needed. Withdrawal, the bravest verb, begins on time. Boats nose free, then in file. Oars lift and drop with the steadiness of sleep. The inlet returns to its earlier profession of looking like nothing at all. Behind, wind picks at a line and finds no flag worth bragging over. Ahead, the raiders tow what can be learned from and drown what must not be found again. Results travel quietly but far. A royal design that leaned on regular bread and brisk powder must relearn hunger. A column that counted days by convoy must change its math. A city, under pressure, feels the invisible touch of relief, as if a window had opened in a room no one could enter. Among the men who work the fjord, talk is brief. A tally, a nod, a shared sip, and then silence resumes, because silence is what brought them here and will bring them home. They will remember Heligoland not as triumph but as validation. That small places, well read, can answer large questions. That knowledge of edges and turns, of where rock shadows water, of where echoes die, can do the labour of armies. Night loosens its shoulders and lets stars through. Pine resin warms under a shy breeze. The oarlocks tick like clocks deciding to be kind. He, meaning all of them, looks outward past the headland and feels the century tilt. There will be other shores where Denmark's hope is a citizen's hope rather than a sailor's. Ramparts of earth, not granite. Relief by forced march, not by oar. Dawns, where the mist is made of meadow instead of brine. A name rises from a later map in that softened dark Fredericia. Earthworks at the edge of Jutland sand, a city ringed and waiting for a morning when men will lift the siege the way a careful hand lifts a sleeping child. The boats slide on. The fjord closes like a book whose lesson has been read, and somewhere ahead the land begins to smell of clay and rye, and the low, steady promise of a rampart facing east. You're now listening to Part 14, Fredericia, 1849. Before dawn, on Jutland's sandy edge, a ring of earthworks waits like a held breath, and a besieged town gathers its quiet strength for a step taken outward. He stands, not one man, but a composed intent, along parapets packed with clay and hope. The North Sea's damp carried inland on a small faithful wind. Lamps are hooded, voices paired to gestures, and the wish that threads through every ribcage is plain as bread. Lift the siege without breaking the town that asked to live. Behind him, Fredericia keeps its domestic grammar, pumps, courtyards, a child's toy set carefully on a sill, while outside entrenchments and parallels scratch the open ground where Schleswig-Holstein positions have settled with winter patience into summer certainty. Doubts creep early like ground mist. Are the columns aligned? Will the sand hold under running feet? Will the clocks strike together when minutes must behave? Can the ruses, dummy fires, decoy patrols really persuade the night to be on our side? And if surprise phrase, will courage stitch fast enough? Out beyond the ditch, the besiegers' camps lie tidy in their own belief. Gabions squared, pickets measured, guns sighted to read the ramparts at a glance. No malice, only the sober arithmetic of containment. The town's answer gathers help in homely forms, engineers who know the weight of a sod, sappers who trust the way clay remembers a spade, guides who can count strides between thorn bushes in the dark, priests with short blessings and quartermasters with longer lists, a captain who speaks in distances and a sergeant who speaks in shoulders. Orders pass with the softness of cloth. This gate, that ravine, the battery first, then the line. Keep the pace low until the ground begins to take your breath. When the hour tilts, the earthworks offer their dark mouths. Ladders and fascines move, as if learning to be quiet animals. Boots find the ditch with a muffled certainty, and the sortie, this paradox of defence stepping forward, enters the besieger's map, like a small, precise error that multiplies. Contact begins as a change in temperature. A sentry's challenge thins into confusion. A picket's fire cracks like dry twigs, and then is swallowed by a closer, heavier grammar. Volleys at touching distances, the blunt talk of bayonets in lanes of trampled rye, the short commands that keep 100 hearts beating together. The inner quarrel, hurry or hold, scratches at every mind. Habit answers, breathe, aim, do not run with your thoughts. A ditch that promised to slow attackers becomes a road for men who practice this hour under rain. A battery that looks secure in daylight finds itself seen from angles it had not imagined. Gun crews trained to work by the metronome of siege fire discover the metronome can stutter under a rush that does not shout. Helps arrive at the scale of hands. A section leader points once, and a file goes left around a thorn. A sapper drops a fascine exactly where a foot will need it in 4 seconds. A drummer who should not be here keeps a pulse low enough to steady and high enough to carry. The town's garrison does not sprint so much as insist. Where the line wavers, it is retied by names spoken into smoke. Where the smoke thickens, men remember the map traced on their palms. Where fear dries the mouth, someone's canteen appears like a small sacrament and then vanishes back to work. The field learns new edges as the surprise hardens into pressure. Redoubts that had been nouns become verbs, taken, turned. Guns that pointed inward now speak outward with an altered accent. A camp street becomes a corridor of decision where carts, suddenly without allegiance, are persuaded to stand as walls. Opposite, resistance does not disgrace itself. Companies stiffen. Officers lay swords along air with the old cool grammar. Reserves step off toward the noise with the straight-back decency of men who do not ask the day to be gentler than it is. For long minutes that feel like a drawn bow, the lines trade breath and iron without the shitter of banners, only the steadying sight of each other's shoulders. Then the crest presents itself not as a cheer, but as a widening. A salient unzips underweight, placed exactly. A battery falls silent and is found speaking, a minute later, in a new direction. A gap that could have swallowed courage is bridged by 2 planks and 30 choices to cross. Somewhere a standard dips, is caught, and moves again. Somewhere a voice says now, with the authority of weather, and the map folds toward release. Retreat takes the besiegers with the formality of men who know what they owe their trade. Limbers tug guns that can be saved. Files narrow into correct paths. Colours back away without losing their meaning. The sortie does not pursue beyond wisdom's edge. It holds what the town needs held, spikes what must not turn again, gathers what can be carried, and counts what must be mourned. Dawn discovers new geometry. Trenches reversed, captured pieces aligned like persuaded arguments, a perimeter that breathes like a chest no longer banded. Fredericia inhales, once long, and the exhale fills streets with the work that follows thunder. Bindings, broth, ink, and the slow, holy arithmetic of names. The result is not triumph, hammered into brass, but continuity, handed back to a place that kept faith with itself. The siege lifted, the road opened, the sea wind meeting alleyways without asking permission. On the earthworks, men sit with their backs against the clay that stood up for them, and the clay, still warm from the night's handling, lets them. A chaplain lowers his eyes. An engineer smiles at a traverse as if at a well-made chair. A runner sleeps in the shadow of a gun that has fallen quiet. And yet the day refuses to be a period. It is a comma in a longer sentence, written by rain and will. North and west, the plain opens into weather and argument. Names gather in low cloud. Isted, where a year later, a battle will widen under cold, relentless showers until the very air seems made of drumbeat and water, roads that turn to ribboned mud, standards heavy with wet, decisions taken at the pace of soaked leather. As the sun lifts over the roofs, burnishing wet ropes and the patient backs of Garbians, he, being all who stepped outward and returned, lets the line of sight run past the newly quiet trenches into that broader grey. The clay cools under his shoulder, gulls swing low from the little belt, and the next page loosens in the weather, smelling of rain and rye and the long, even courage of a field that will ask men to hold, not for minutes, but for a day that refuses to end. You're now listening to Part 15, Isted, 1850. Rain drapes the Schleswig fields in long, silver threads, and a grey morning spreads itself like damp linen over hedges, lanes, and the slow-beating hearts of men. He stands, not one figure, but a whole line, breathing, upon the wide, sodden ground near the village of Isted, where trackways turn to ribboned mud, and the wind carries the smell of rye and wet leather, and the wish inside every rib cage is simple as bread. Hold long enough for the map to remember Denmark the way it once did. Hold so that farms may hear only summer thunder, not the measured anger of guns. The origin is modest, a ridge, a church spire that appears and disappears in drizzle, a market road that knows cartwheels better than caissons. Yet within that modestness grows the day's stern hope. If they stand here, the siege of yesterday will become the breathing space of tomorrow. Doubts are early arrivals, as constant as rain flies in warm weather. The cartridges feel heavy with damp. The powder sulks. Coats cling coldly to backs. Orders must travel not by flourish, but by voice close to the ear. Beyond the rain curtain, the Schleswig-Holstein ranks gather in the same weather, careful and resolute, their guns set upon slight rises like brass bees at the edge of a meadow, their infantry stitched into tidy lines that look, through the blur, like hedges moving. He wonders, he, meaning every man within this long, patient seam, whether the ground will side with courage or with weight, whether rivers of runoff will knit or fray their fronts, whether the day's grammar will be written in volleys or in the quiet syllables of the bayonet. Helps arrive in human scale. Old sergeants who can keep a company from stiffening into fear simply by standing where the air is most honest. Quartermasters with oilcloth and faith, moving from cart to cart like discreet saints. A chaplain who has learned to keep prayers short and hands warm. A farmer guide who points with 2 fingers at the low fold that will keep men unseen until the right breath. The guns open without theatre, as if they were knocking politely on a door they intend to enter. The rain carries each report away in soft tatters. Smoke refuses to billow, and instead lies low, a sheep's fleece dragged along the grass. Skirmishers wade forward, their gait, the cautious stride of men who have learned to read puddles. Companies shift, like blinds being drawn and lifted. The file closes, talk in brief domestic words. Steady, wait, now, until the line feels like a house with many rooms, but one roof. Within the chest, the quieter battle nags, numb fingers on flint, boots that gulp at mud with every step, a mind that insists on remembering kitchens at the exact moment the hedge ahead needs all of one's sight. The The opposing will is competent and unsentimental. Their volleys stitch rain to earth with a needle's precision. Their batteries make punctuation where punctuation is not invited. A colour dips and is held. A captain who prefers understatement sets his jaw and finds, in the exact angle of his sword, a way to move 100 souls one pace to the good. Cavalry on the margins tries the ground and learns new courtesy. Horses breathe fog, and sabres lift like pale fish, flashing only dully under a woolen sky before vanishing into the thick air. The day's slope steepens, not with spectacle, but with the slow insistence of water-wearing stone. The Danes push where the ridge lends them a little height, and the rain, companion and trader, chooses when to veil and when to reveal. The enemy checks with hard, honest skill, then answers, then leans, and a battery that seemed secure at dawn becomes uncertain at noon, wheels seeking purchase on a sodden seam until a dozen shoulders, wordless, become wedges. The piece speaks again, and men to left and right breathe as if someone had opened a shutter. A drummer's hands go numb, but his pulse remembers its work, and the sticks obey the blood's rhythm instead of the weather's. In the long middle, where battles truly happen, a ditch that promised to be a fence turns out to be a road. The files incline, then straighten, then incline again, a field of wheat-learning wind. Fear travels like a draught under a door. Habit stuffs rags at the sill. A runner is lost, and another appears as if the line had grown itself a new nerve. The crest, when it gathers, is a grey hush, weighted with decision. Along the isted ground, a series of near things become one sufficient thing. Companies that did not quite connect now do. A reserve that left the lane 5 minutes late arrives in the 1 minute that will be told for years. Fire slackens where it ought and strengthens where it must. The weather, capricious clerk, signs its name under the Danish column rather than in the enemy's ledger. The front swells forward like a banked breath finally exhaled. Standards, wet and heavy, pull like anchors and yet go on. The muzzles speak in a steadier register. A hedge that had been edge becomes threshold. Across the field, the Schleswig-Holstein line bends in the correct soldierly way of men who will not waste themselves. Their guns leap back to new stances. Their files narrow. Their pride does not spill on the ground. It is carried away intact, which is its own quiet honour. The rain goes on with its older business of making rye and patience, but the thunder it hosted all morning begins to drift down the scale into workaday noise. Orders counted, litters passed, horses coaxed, names answered. The result feels less like triumph than like a season turning. The largest battle of this war unknots into clarity. Fredericia's breath was not a single lucky gasp. It belongs to a longer inhale. The countryside hears it. Farms begin to imagine harvest untroubled by picks and fascines. A miller closes his hand around a lever and finds it is only wood again. On the ridge, men sit with their backs to the damp earth that held them and eat the kind of food that tastes after rain like a holiday, coarse bread, something warm, a joke that would not be funny at any other hour. The chaplain wipes his sleeve across a name. He has not had to ride on linen. The surgeon counts and finds the count, for once, favours the living. Evening discovers the field's high points and low with a gentler eye. The church spire dries in tatters and then in plains. Hedges breathe out a green odour that feels like advice. Go home when you can, and if you cannot, behave as if a home waits anyway. He, meaning all who stood within this long, rain-drawn sentence, lets his gaze drift south and back along the year's thread to an earlier stitch that made today possible. A smaller town, a contested hinge, a tactical retreat that behaved like a promise rather than a failure. Colding, streets that know cartwheels and counsel, a river that edits plans, a step back taken so that other steps might be taken forward. In that soft rinsed light, the road bends toward those narrower lanes where prudence and resolve will meet in 1849 and, without trumpet, teach tomorrow how to begin. 2. You're now listening to Part 16, Colding, 1849. In a small river town where bridges fold the banks together, the day learns that stepping back can be a way of holding fast. He stands, not a single figure, but the composed outline of a rearguard on damp cobbles that remember carts and market talk more than march in feet, and the wish that travels ribcage to ribcage is modest. Keep the door from slamming. Keep a path open for the army to breathe. Keep coaling from becoming a trap that teaches only regret. The town is a hush of tiled roofs and careful windows. The river makes its slow, editing line through reeds and pilings. The castle hill holds itself like an elder who has already seen too much. Within that quiet, doubts move like minnows. What if the bridges go too soon or too late? What if the lanes become funnels? What if resolve, stretched thin by rain and nights without sleep, snaps with the sound of wet twine? Beyond the outlying gardens, the enemy arranges itself with cool competence, files exact and patient, guns already measuring angles through the grey. They are not cruel, merely thorough, and their thoroughness threatens to turn the town into a conclusion. Officers in Danish coats study corners, courtyards, hedges that might bite once before yielding. Engineers walk with the pacing calm of men who intend to let timber and earth do half their speaking. Sergeants translate plans into breathing, quietly, without applause. The purpose is not to win a page of brass here, but to purchase time without spending lives unnecessarily, to refold the map so that the lines lean toward Fredericia instead of into a knot around Coling's steeple. Helps arrive wearing ordinary faces. A miller shows where a shallow Ford takes a cartwheel without stealing the axle. A widow points with a knitting needle at a lane that looks straight but bends just enough to mislead sighting. A ferryman who knows current by smell stands among soldiers and names eddies that will turn boats if oars are unready. Powder is kept dry under oilcloth. Fuses are cut to trustworthy lengths. A chaplain palms shoulders as if passing a coin of warmth from hand to hand. The town's grammar, door, step, beam, lends itself to defence without drama. A wain set crosswise becomes a sentence. A stack of barrels becomes a comma where an advance must pause and reread. The inner struggle hums. Pride wants to stand and stamp the ground and declare. Prudence asks for measured footsteps, for the grace of not confusing courage with insistence. Habit, the old schoolmaster, sides with prudence, files dress to hedges, not horizons. Volleys are husbanded. Messages pass by touch when the air grows thick. The first exchanges begin with a winter's politeness, skirmishes, trading pinpricks along garden walls, musketry that sounds like branches shrugged in wind, then thicken where the lanes constrict. Street by street, the town converses with iron, short, exact sentences from windows and corners, replies that strike plaster into powder and send roof tiles skating. A battery on a low rise speaks with a voice that makes horses bow their heads. A pair of guns, nested near the bridge, lift their muzzles and place punctuation where the enemy's grammar becomes run-on. Yet the point is not to turn Colding into a last stand. At each threatened corner the rearguard appears firm, then thinner, then elsewhere, elastic without breaking, present without becoming fixed. A company shows itself in a square long enough to be counted, then melts into alleys that a child could outline in chalk across the river, pioneers stack timbers and ropes, and do not yet look at the axemen waiting like a final clause. Civility survives in strange, small ways. A woman lifts a child over a puddle as if this were any morning. A shopkeeper locks his door, not because he imagines locks can deny wars, but because he wants to give himself one honest action to do with his hands. A corporal steadies a private's buckle, then points with 2 fingers at the sill his men must occupy. A drummer tests a low roll and decides the day requires heartbeat, not thunder. Fear, when it knocks, is turned away by labour. Powder to place, a cart to shift, a plank to set. The enemy presses in the decent manner of professionals, probing for a seam that will not retie. They find stubborn seams instead, narrow fire that bites and is gone, empty streets that were crowded a breath ago, a bridge mouth that looks welcoming until the first file learns the weight of a hidden angle. Signals slide along rooflines, orders reduced to verbs that fit between breaths: hold, ease, go. The crest is not a blaze, but a hinge. The outer pickets have folded. The lanes have said almost everything they can say. The bridge, this chapter's quiet centre, waits for its single unrepeatable moment. On the far bank, ranks have been dressed to receive. On the near, the last platoon takes 2 steps back without becoming a rumour, then 2 more that feel like removing a stitch without tearing a sleeve. A gun speaks one final time with a note heard at Fredericia later as a kind of promise. The axe comes down in practice strokes. Timbers gasp and sag. Water, which has no politics, receives what it is given and smooths its ripples as if asleep. No cheer, no grand gesture, only the soft decisive sound of a passage closed at the precise minute when closing is grace. Afterward the town breathes out and in again, astonished to find breathing still belongs to it. Smoke thins into kitchen smell. Cobbles show their honest wet. The river holds a new reflection where the bridge used to be. The rearguard, already dwindling into the hedges upriver, becomes less a sight than a sense, the after-image of discipline. The enemy stands where prudence tells it to stand and measures the next crossing, exact and undespairing. Their correctness is its own respect. On the Danish flank, the road to the west opens like a vein that has chosen not to close. Wagons move without drama. Standards, furled against drizzle, ride like asleep flags. The result is not a story that makes statues. It is a breath that allows other stories to live. Fredericia's dawn to be arranged, Isted's endurance to be possible, a child to grow up believing a town can be both brave and sensible. Dusk trims the roofs in pewter, the river speaks softly against its reed beds. He, meaning all those who stood and those who arranged the standing, turns his gaze far away from cobble and reed and hears in the deep room of time another kind of retreat that did not feel like grace at all, a king's pride carried into rain and ruin, regiments scattered against a German woodland stern arithmetic, a banner folding into mud while Europe watched itself learn a new, harsh grammar of war. The map tilts back 2 centuries. The air smells of wet oak and powder. The name that answers is Lutter. And somewhere under a lowering sky, in a field not yet forgiving, hoofbeats begin to drum like the slow approach of a thought no one is ready to think. You're now listening to Part 17, Lutter, 1626. Under low August clouds, the 30 Years' War breathes its damp iron breath over a German wood, and hoofbeats arrive like a slow, unwelcome thought. He stands, not one man, but the composite of banners and weary hopes, on fields near Luther and Barenberg, where hedgerows seam the land and lanes lead into groves that hold their own counsel, and the wish that travels along the Danish line is almost homelike in its plainness. Hold the slope, keep the army together, prove that a northern crown can still fold order around a season that wants only to scatter. The origin is simple. A king, Christian IV, far from coasts that understand him, carrying allies' expectations like a pack too full of careful letters, a road matted with rain, a morning that will not choose brightness. Doubt arrives early in practical shapes, columns stretched long by mud, fords that edit timetables without apology, powder sulking, cavalry whose horses hear the forest's damp hush and prefer it to the trumpet, and across the field an imperial host, Tillies, stitched tight with the patience of veterans who have learned to count minutes like coins. Staff officers speak in thin voices over maps that pucker when wetted. Couriers return with news that is not disastrous, only slow. A chaplain keeps blessings short, as if brevity could be made into armour. The army's inner weather trembles. These are not straits and belts where shoals can be recruited into friendship. This is interior land that asks other alphabets: hedge, lane, hill, marsh, and Denmark must read them quickly, gently, without tearing the page. Across the damp, the adversary gathers with schoolroom neatness. Catholic League, infantry in steady blocks, guns planted on modest rises like brass hives, cavalry poised where fields narrow. The whole array set to let terrain do part of its talking. There is no malice in their arrangement. There is the sober will of men who have lived through enough thunder to know the tempo of advantage. The Danish ranks, wider than their confidence, lengthen to meet them, companies breathing unevenly, drums pricking the morning with small determined taps. Helps arrive in human scale, a lieutenant who has walked the ground and points to a fold of earth that will keep a battery unseen until it speaks, farriers that soothe horses with the intimate grammar of palm and breath, quartermasters who find dry cartridges as if they were retrieving lost names. But doubts keep their edge. Reserves placed by necessity sit farther back than comfort. Marshy seams cut files into ribbons. The line's long middle has a habit of listening too hard to rumour. The first exchanges are careful and close, as if both sides test not only each other, but the day itself. Skirmishes fold through hedges. Muskets pop like damp firewood. Guns begin to knit a low ceiling of sound. Denmark's forward brigades, wanting to pin and not be pinned, step into a lane that narrows when it ought to widen, and the geometry of mischance tightens. Mud slows, brush grips, and on the edges, imperial cavalry tilt their heads to the opportunity and ease forward. Orders try to thread a maze of trees and carts. Some arrive, some wander. Inside the ribs of the line, the quieter battle wakes. Mind against drift, hand against tremor, the small necessary bravery of keeping one's world narrowed to flint, pan, and the shoulder just to the left. A banner dips, refuses to fall. A captain counts his men, counts them again, and turns counting into steadiness. Pressure gathers as a weather front, deliberate, gradual, the field changing by degrees until it is suddenly different. Tilly's guns, speaking from their little terraces, place their heavy syllables where Danish formations hesitate. Volleys walk the hedges. When cavalry meet at the margins, the clatter is intimate and breathy, not theatrical. Pistols forced to work in air that smells of wet hay, sabres lifted without flash, the ground taking hooves the way a ledger takes sums. A Danish counter-push, meant to iron a crease before it becomes a tear, finds itself snagged on a watercourse that appears only when boots go ankle deep. A wing that hoped for a hinge discovers it is a door swung too wide. Fear visits in domestic shapes, slippery grips, mislaid wads. the mind's treacherous slide toward better evenings, and is answered by domestic cures, a sergeant's sleeve on a man's neck, a canteen tipped once, then put away, the patient, unshowy tone that turns a crowd back into a company. Courage, where it lives, keeps to work. A battery in place behind a poor hedge learns to fire low and steady. Its crews move with the mechanical kindness of men who have already agreed to forgive each other's mistakes. A regiment that wavers at the sight of an advancing block discovers that a single pair of boots, set square at the line's edge, can quiet a dozen pairs around it. A drummer's hands, numbed by rain, remember the rhythm even when the sticks fumble. Heartbeat over heroics. Yet the field's arithmetic remains stern. The imperial infantry, denser and more precise, bite and hold. The Danish centre, long and thin, as a thought stretched past usefulness, begins to flutter at the edges of meaning. Messages cross and miss. A reserve commits a shade late and finds itself welding two tired parts rather than striking a fresh note. Horses blow hard, flags become heavy. The afternoon closes its hand. There is a crest, and it sounds like water poured from one bowl into another, Danish effort spilling, imperial will receiving. The right folds first, then the centre gives a yard, 2 yards, a furlong. The left, stubborn, retreats as if measuring its own honour in exact inches. What was line becomes islands, and between islands the enemy's grammar flows, files widening into streets, cavalry walking rather than charging, as if sparing breath for certainty. Panic knocks, lightly at first, then louder, and across that knock-in passes the small rescue of authority. A colonel who imagines he is a carpenter and fits his fragments together by eye. A king whose presence, battered hat, and rain-limbed beard is less a rally than a permission to depart in order. Retreat is chosen because annihilation refuses to be useful. Guns limber out of holes that were nearly graves. Standards travel by discreet paths. A rear guard ties its courage into narrow knots and holds just long enough for the rest to become a moving story rather than a broken one. Evening, pitying, lowers its wet curtain. On lanes behind the field, litters bob. Surgeons' lanterns make shallow rooms of light where hands choose life as often as skill allows. Chaplains keep silence except for names. Quartermasters already plan the next dawn's bread, because bread is what armies must eventually become again if they intend to exist. Ludder does not offer victory's medal. For Denmark it offers the heavier lesson that inland wars demand a patience with mud and hedge that sea-trained nerve does not automatically grant, that allies' hopes must be answered with placements as exact as promises, that a crown should keep a coastline within reach, or else time and distance will steal calendar and courage both. There is shame in the telling, and yet there is also the stern dignity of survival. The army, not unmade, but sobered, learns the grammar of withdrawing without dropping its pen. The kingdom keeps the memory like a bruise that teaches where not to lean next time. Night plants itself in the hedges. Owls replace trumpets. A single cartwheel squeaks like a child refusing sleep and then quiets. He, being all who stood and all who stepped back, looks through the rain's curtain toward an earlier shoreline where Denmark once pressed outward with more luck to a young king in a harder century, blades and boats worrying the threshold of Kalmar's proud gate. The map folds north, the air salts itself, and the next page lifts, 1611, a siege and sorties along the Baltic's lip, stone and surf, and the tense, narrow courage of men who must take a city brick by sensible brick, while gulls watch without advice. You're now listening to Part 18, Kalmar, 1611. The shore is salted with wind, stone holds its breath, and a gateway city lifts its walls like folded wings against the Baltic. He stands, not one man, but the collected patience of besiegers, on weed-slick rocks below Kalmar's bastions, where gulls make small, indifferent circles, and the surf works its old arithmetic against the foot of the town, and the wish that threads through every chest is spare and stubborn, to take the key without breaking the door, to turn a long quarrel over coasts and customs into a hinge that finally swings. This is the beginning. Boats shouldered through shallow chop, ladders bundled like sleeping ribs, trenches scratched forward under the measured scolding of enemy fire. The Danish crowns of a younger century bright against steel that still smells of forge. Doubts creep early in usable shapes. Saps may flood in a night tide. Powder cakes if a sleeve is careless. A bastion that looks tired at dusk wakes mean at dawn. And beyond these stones, the Swedish garrison, wary, well posted, acquainted with this light, keeps its own compact wish to hold, to make every embrasure a sentence, and every lane behind the wall a reserve of breath. The inner quarrel travels within every file, hurry temps, habit answers, a sergeant's low voice ties impatience into knots that can be untied only at the right minute. Helps arrive in homely forms, engineers who can read soil by its smell, carpenters who coax a palisade into place with 3 quiet taps, pilots who talk tide as if it were a neighbour, chaplains with short blessings and longer sleeves for lifting, batteries nose up on sledges, Gabians settle. A boy with powder-stained wrists learns the correct, small pride of a safe fuse. The opening torque of iron is slow. Testing shots that trim weeds off the top of the counterscarp, replies that clip stones and leave a flinny taste on the air. Then day by day the grammar thickens. Ricochet, splinter, hush, resume. Within the walls, the enemy moves like housekeepers in a storm. Buckets and beams, signals running along a stair, a captain glancing once at a chapel door before he takes the ladder that leads to smoke. Outside, the sea keeps time. Barges shuttle, ropes creak. The camp whisper of bread, saltfish, and news from home makes a second softer siege around the men who wait. Fear comes in domestic outfits. Wet tinder, a rung that bites the palm. The mind's treachery when it imagines a street smelled only once in summer and is answered by other domestics. Wool dried by a brazier, a shared sip that is half warmth and half reminder, the square-nodded assurance of drilled hands. Assaults are rehearsed in sand with twigs for walls and buttons for towers. Then the day chooses itself, and real ladders are shouldered into the hard light. Gunfire shears air into narrow lanes. Boats scrape under a quay, where the water slaps like a steady metronome. The first men up see the world as rungs and breath, the next as elbows, boots, the sour shock of lime dust. And all of them hear, too closely, other men's prayers turned into working sounds. Now, hold, here. A gate that has been argued with for weeks shudders under a petard's dull persuasion. A flank battery that would not be silent learns a new angle of reply from an enfilade coaxed into being by 2 patient crews and a sledged gun. Inside, the defenders counter with the thrift of professionals. A barricade appears where an alley was empty. A sally breaks like a hard cough and is gone. Muskets speak from windows as if the town itself had grown eyes. Courage keeps ordinary tools, a marline spike, a hammer, a ladle, a captain's palm flattened against a trembling back, a powder boy taking the long way because the short way breaks hearts. The crest is not trumpet but sufficiency. A bastion that would not lean, leans. A breach becomes a door. Ladders, tilt inward more often than outward, and the water, which watched without help all summer, seems to lie a shade quieter, as if relieved to be out of the argument. Surrender, when it is spoken, has the weary decency of men who have counted and counted again. Keys are given without theatrics. Officers look at each other with the old sailor's respect that says simply, "We worked." After, the town exhales in human registers. Well ropes slap, shutters breathe. A child cries, because a bell that always rang is silent today. The result is not glory hammered loud. It is a right of way regained, a seam of coast taught to speak a familiar language, convoys that will make their winter rounds under a flag that knows these waters by first name. In the Danish camp, voices lower to the pitch of mending, lists written, wound cloth folded, a gun carriage planed where splinters bit too deep. Officers look along the Baltic and understand that this key turns other locks: trade, duty, the uneasy comfort of a map less jagged than yesterday's. Evening puts soft copper on rampart and oar. Smoke thins to a memory that will cling to coats for a year. He, meaning all who climbed, waded, and set their feet on the stone, lets his gaze slide far down the century, past sieges answered and set aside, to a small island in the North Sea, where wind has its own moral and iron ships learn new manners. There were in 1864 flags will meet amid broken water at Heligoland, and the thunder will be modern. Steam in the lungs of hulls, shells that think before they fall, signals speaking faster than gulls. The sea takes a slow breath. The harbour tucks in its lights. And somewhere beyond the darkened parapet, a newer wake unspools toward that red rock, steady as a heartbeat. You're now listening to Part 19, Heligoland, 1864. We slip into broken water and red cliffs, where steam breathes through iron lungs and sails still remember how to listen to wind. He stands, not one sailor but the gathered steadiness of a squadron, on planks that smell of salt and hot paint, while boilers murmur below like large drowsy animals, and the North Sea rolls its long slate shoulders toward the small, stubborn island of Heligoland. The wish that moves from deck to deck is compact and clear. Keep the blockade's promise a little longer, meet a heavier alliance with placement and nerve, and bring the ships home with masts and men accounted for. This is the origin. Denmark's flag in windy company with gulls, a commander measuring distance, not only in miles but in treaties, British neutrality drawing a pale protective ring around those red cliffs, and somewhere to the southeast, an Austro-Prussian force shouldering outward, eager to push the Danish cordon off the lanes of Germany's shore. Doubts travel with the spray, steam is strong until it sulks, signals can tangle in smoke. The sea near Heligoland makes odd echoes that fool the ear, and the enemy's metal is newer in places, their numbers a stern arithmetic that does not blush. On the Danish decks, petty officers smooth those doubts the way a hand calms a skittish horse, charts folded to useful squares, ranges rehearsed, crews reminded that the island is not a shield but a neighbour, close enough to help, close enough to complicate. Out across the swell, funnels and yards of the opposing squadron rise, like a moving skyline, Austrian black hulls, Prussian resolve, captains reading the grey morning with the cool rigour of men who expect the day to answer their sums. They do not come to parade, they come to pry. The wind keeps a shy quarter, the tide thinks of turning, and the island, red and square-shouldered, holds its silence like an umpire, ready to step between blows the moment neutrality is touched. Helps arrive to the Danish side in ordinary forms that war rarely remembers to praise. A pilot who knows the way, sound travels between cliff and spume, gunners whose hands can set elevation by bone more than by scale. a signalman who speaks in flags as if talking to family. Steam rises. Paddle wheels or screws tighten their quiet fists under the foam. The squadron dresses its line, not ostentatious, only clean, and the island's hard profile slides to starboard like a patient guardian who will not move first. The opening is a conversation of measured voices. Guns begin in pairs, then in patient triplets. Smoke springs and lies along the water, in soft carpets that heave and fold. Between the curtains, silhouettes resolve and blur as if the sea were blinking. The Danes keep their speech spare, no waste, no anger, placing shots the way a carpenter places pegs, true and at intervals that build strength. The adversary presses with cool insistence, answers heavier, tries angles meant to make the Danish formation trade certainty for bravado. Inside every rib cage, the quieter struggle unknots and knots again. Don't hurry, don't aim at smoke. Take the breath that keeps the hand from lying. A shell finds a bracket and rings the hole like a struck bell. Men flinch, then return to sentences begun before fear interrupted. The island watches without commentary. Above, gulls wheel like erased handwriting. Mid-fight, wind and treaty draw closer to the day's heart. Heligoland's neutral waters lie like a pale seam on the chart, and both sides feel that stitched line in their nerves. The Austrians lean hardest, Schwarzenberg showing a sharp will and a quick tongue of flame. The Prussians keep company with intelligent caution. Together they try to push Denmark's ships far enough from the cliff's long veto that weight can finish what skill has begun. Danish captains answer with seamanship that looks almost modest. A point of helm saved here, a cable's length brought there. Steering not to flee, but to recompose. Sliding the fight by degrees toward that pale seam, where law and geography shake hands. A broadside catches just right and sends a hot, ragged sigh up from an Austrian deck. Rigging slaps, a funnel coughs, a cheer is born, and then carefully clipped before it becomes arrogance. Steam, smoke, and wind mingle until the sea smells of iron tea. Courage keeps homely tools. A powder boy chooses the longer route because he trusts his feet there, and the gun he serves thanks him by still speaking. A carpenter's hammer ticks like a small clock inside a splintered bulwark, and time becomes usable again. A surgeon, in a white shirt that will never be white again, sets his hands as if laying out Sunday cloth. A chaplain grips a stanchion and says nothing, because quiet is the medicine men need at this minute. Signals rise, neat even in gusts. Replies jump, mast to mast, as if the ships were a single many-lunged creature. The enemy is gallant, their gunnery crisp, their captains refuse to be hurried into mistakes, but the island has its say by simply standing where it stands, and the Danes, by inches, by posture, drift the duel toward the rule that says enough. The crest is a breath held at the cliff's red shoulder. Schwarzenberg shows fire where fire should not be. A turn becomes a wince. The line that pressed now gathers itself, checks bearings, and measures what honour requires and what prudence forbids. Danish ships, scarred but cohesive, ease behind the neutral veil, with the decorum of mariners who know that seamanship includes knowing when water belongs to law rather than to courage. Guns fall silent, not as a favour, but as obedience to a boundary older than any captain on deck. The wind freshens as if relieved. The island keeps its stone counsel. What follows is not trumpet, it is verdict deferred. Tactically, there is the warm relief of survival with purpose. Masts still counting sky, crews answering names, colours steady. Strategically, an aftertaste of inevitability. The blockade's rope will slacken. A larger war's land arithmetic will outweigh today's seacraft, and Denmark will learn again that bravery cannot always balance coal and iron and numbers. Yet dignity remains. Ships, shaped by a nation of shoals and straits, have spoken clearly in modern water. Seamanship has made law visible, and in the hush that settles under the cliff, there is a sense, not of triumph, that would be a noisy word, but of rightness kept, of a standard borne through new thunder without dropping its old, careful light. Evening polishes the red rock. Smoke thins into blue threads that drift toward England like unmailed letters. Deck planks cool. Men drink water that tastes of iron and relief. A gull lands, cocks its head, and forgets the day immediately, which is its wisdom. The sea resumes its ancient job of being merely sea. He, being all who stood through steam and sail, lets his gaze travel away from the iron shine to a quieter shore where history moves on foot. Cobbles and hedgerows, August dust, and men in simple coats shouldering muskets, not because they are perfect for war, but because a county asked them to come. They're far back across the years to 1807. A town on Shelland will discover how courage looks when it is mostly made of citizens. The Battle of Køge, where militia stand in smoke that smells of rye fields and summer barns, and where defeat will still write a line about duty that does not fade. The wake behind Heligoland unspools and settles. The island's red fades to ink, and somewhere beyond, the quieting boilers. A bell in a country church imagines itself being rung by hands that do not tremble. You're now listening to Part 20, Køge, 1807. This final chapter stands in summer light over rye fields and hedgerows, where citizen hands steady muskets and duty wears the plain clothes of home. He stands, not a lone militiaman, but the gathered breath of Sjelland's farmers and shopkeepers, on the approaches to Køge, where lanes run between stone walls and hayricks, and the wind smells of salt from the bay, and warm straw from barns left open for air. The wish that passes along the irregular file is humble, almost shy. Hold the road long enough that the county keeps its shape. Hold so the bells this evening will ring for ordinary reasons. Hold so that bread rises without flinching at thunder. There is no pageantry here, only jackets that don't quite match, hats that remember church more than drill, and muskets whose stocks were rubbed with oil as carefully as a table meant for guests. Doubt, honest and early, moves through the ranks. The enemy's regulars are close and correct. Volleys will arrive with the schoolmaster's exactness. Courage must learn to stand where habit would prefer to step aside. Yet helps arrive in modest forms. An old sergeant whose voice can turn a crowd into a line. A priest with sleeves rolled who says nothing theatrical, only breathe. A cooper who understands the weight of wood and quietly braces a fence into a breastwork that will hold just long enough. The beginning is domestic. Shutters latched, a jug set in the shade for later. A mother packing a heel of bread into a pocket that once kept only nails and string. Fields, patient and green, lend their hedges as teeth. Lanes lend their curves as punctuation. A footbridge offers its brief, stubborn sentence over a ditch that nearby children know by its frog song. Outside the town, the opposing line composes itself with the crisp grammar of professionals. Boots in cadence, colours edged like rules. Officers placing men with the reliable gestures of those long acquainted with this conversation. They are not cruel. They are exact, and exactness has a way of silencing poetic hopes. The first shots are small. Local syllables, pickets startled into honesty along a hedgerow, a crack that startles birds into the sky. Then the day clears its throat and begins to speak in larger words, volleys that flatten the air, drums that keep time, for men who have learned to make their hearts obey external clocks. The militia answer in household's tones, short, careful fire from corners where time grows under stones, a file stepping forward because the man behind has 3 children, and the one ahead no ring. A bucket line that remembers last year's barn blaze, now passing cartridges instead of water. Fear arrives not as terror, but as dryness in the mouth, the treacherous curiosity to look the wrong way at the wrong instant, the urge to step back one pace more than a hedge will allow. Habit answers, where habit exists. Where it does not, affection does. The affection for neighbour and lane and bell, for the way light falls on a tiled roof at 6 in the evening, for the timbre of a cow calling along a ditch when the sun tips. A banner borrowed from a parish hall leans into wind, humble but legible. Pressure grows like weather. It does not shout. Regular volleys lean into the hedges, trimming them of leaves and courage. Skirmishers worry at gaps until a gap becomes a path. A gun set on a dry mound places punctuation with the finality of law. Yet courage keeps to work. A boy who should still be sweeping a shop threshold passes ball and powder with the exactness of a bookkeeper. No loss, no haste. A cart is turned crosswise and becomes a sentence the enemy must reread. A drummer with blistered hands chooses a pulse so steady that even doubt, listening, cannot find an entrance. In the middle of the day, where battles are decided without announcing it, a company that has no right to be brave finds the angle of a wall and refuses to argue. A captain whose uniform is more hope than issue places his dozen men where 2 dozen would be better, and by the perfect economy of timing makes it enough. A hedge that looked thin behaves like a wall because men long acquainted with pruning know where branches cross like fingers and stiffen each other. The town listens without panic. Windows hold their breath. The church keeps its clock correctly, even as smoke scrapes at the roof tiles. Crest, when it arrives, looks like inevitability, a tide that has measured every stone and now spends the tallied inches. The militia line phrase, where drill cannot reinforce will, a colour dips and is rescued by a hand that will be remembered only by 3 men and 1 grateful priest. The road that seemed held an hour ago is suddenly a ribbon, across which correctness walks in step. Orders to fall back find their proper weight. Retreat is not disgrace here, only the long intelligence that allows a county to exist tomorrow. Files step away from walls with the dignity of men walking out of church. A gun that can be saved is limbered with a carpenter's quiet care. The bridge gives its last plank to a timing so exact it feels like providence or practice, perhaps both. The enemy, brave and thorough, enters with the decency professionals owe, to finish what they have begun without cruelty and without waste. Defeat sets itself down among the militia like a sober uncle, unromantic and instructive, a lesson that love of place must be served by training as well as sentiment, that steadiness is a craft to be learned in quiet seasons if it is to hold in loud ones. After, the air alters, less iron, more hay, smoke thins into kitchen blue, horses drink and forget quickly, crows return to their fence posts to consider what has changed and what hasn't. Women step out with bowls and bandages, water tastes of tin and mercy. Names are checked and checked again. Hands are counted as if they were tools that must be put back in the right drawer. The church bell rings, not for triumph, not for mourning alone, but for presence. We are still here, and in that sound the whole long arc of our journey gathers. Darnevirk's old stones, Misunder's narrow gate, the sleepless ridge at Dybbøl, the lanterns hooded for owls, the harbour lit by bomb arcs over Copenhagen's copper roofs, the careful geometry of Kohlberger Heide and Fehmarn Belt, the winter iron of Lund, the coalition's hinge at Nyborg, and the night of ladders and refusal on Copenhagen's walls, the sly quiet of Dynakiland's oars, the sandy steadiness of Fredericia, the rain-drawn breadth of Isted, the prudence at Coling, the hard humility of Lutter, the sea-worn patience at Kalmar, and the red cliff of Heligoland where law and seamanship braided. Threads of water and hedge, of bread and bell, of mill sails and signal flags, of parish banners and naval ensigns, they run together here, in a modest town where a citizen's pulse stands in for a nation's for one measured day. He, being all who stood in these 20 tellings, lets the gaze travel once more over Denmark's familiar grammar, shoals that taught captains to listen, straits that tuned speech to weather, fields that kept a memory of footsteps longer than any chronicle, ramparts whose clay warmed to the hands that made them, and cities that learned how to breathe again after iron. The lesson at the quiet heart of it all is not the bright word glory, it is the steadier word keeping. Keeping a doorway through winter, keeping a law on water where wind forgets. Keeping a lane in rain until a larger field can be found in sun. Keeping, even in retreat, the shape of return. A nation of belts and islands learned to make allies of edges, to ask place for help, and give place its answer in care. And when place could not answer, when numbers, coal, and century pressed too hard, then the people answered each other with those small, exact human acts that carry tomorrow in their pocket, a hand to a shoulder, a step held for a breath longer than fear permits, a prayer kept short and true. Now, as evening leans over Køge's eaves, and the swallows cut soft signatures above the road, this story eases its oars. The bells count an ordinary hour. The sea folds its long sentences into smaller waves. A mill out in the fields lifts and lowers its arms like someone blessing bread. Thank you for walking the ridge and quay, the ditch and deck, the gate and the shoal in this slow night's company. Thank you for listening with the patience these places deserve. May the images linger gently when you close your eyes. A white mill watching over a quiet hill, lanterns hooded in a salt wind, a hedge holding firm for one more minute, a mast counting a calmer sky, and if sleep comes, let it come as Denmark has often chosen to endure, soft, steady, with the sure knowledge that dawn will find the shoreline where it was, and the bells will ring because people are there to hear them.